So thank you everyone for joining one more time. This is the fourth part of my talks about Dane Rudhyar's book, The Practice of Astrology. And this time we will be speaking about transits and progressions, see how they work in practice. And I will share again several quotes by Rudhyar, which will hopefully give us an idea of how he's thinking about the meaning and the importance of transits and progressions as techniques of not just prediction, but also self-development and working through our course of lifetime with different challenges and crises meaningfully differs from other astrologers or other schools. And what else maybe we can learn from Rudhyar that can then change our perspective when reading a chart. At the end of the session, we'll be looking at example charts, as I already said. Simona volunteered so that we can take a look at how, for example, the progressions over the course of her life. I've only selected a couple of events to show you. And transits mixed with progressions could account for some very important events and happenings that she has been gone through, most of which were quite disturbing and not very positive on the flip side of it. But we'll see. So transits and progressions today. Uh, as always, I show you this first slide every time to remind ourselves what I'm basing this information on. It's the practice of astrology that you can find on codeer.com and read for free. And in that short book, Dane Rudhyar goes through 13 basic steps for acquiring astrological wisdom. We have already covered the first 8 in the previous sessions. You can watch the recordings, catch up with them if you have missed that. But today I will be covering steps 9, 10, and 11 from the book. And then there'll be only a little bit left at the end for next week. And here I will begin jumping straight to the point of the first of those steps, step number 9, which is called establishing a proper attitude toward astrological prediction. Here, Rudhyar is commenting on prediction in general and how we should, maybe consider a few things here. One distinction that he makes, which is not very often made, and even practicing astrologers don't really think about it, is that when we're dealing with a birth chart, like this is an example birth chart here, everything in there is fixed in time and fixed in space. It is a snapshot photograph of the heavens at the moment of birth. And, well, ideally, this moment, if it's very precise, should be the first moment the baby takes its first breath and interacts with the environment, with the world for the first time independently. And that's how we order the charts. That's how we get that two-dimensional view of where in the circle, in zodiac signs, in houses, the planets are. You know that in astrology, we have only selected a few planets to work with. I've already touched on this last time. It's not everything out there in the universe and in the solar system. There are other bodies that we are excluding, or we can choose to maybe expand with asteroids and Arabic parts, many different factors that we can use. But here I'm keeping it to the basics. The 10 planets, the south node and the north node that I always show together because they're on axis. And Chiron, of course, even though technically it's not a planet, but to me it's quite important. And the position of the ascendant. So just so that we can make it simple. Now, what I want to put here is that in the birth chart, we have a set arrangement of things that never changes. Regardless of whether you are 7 years old, 27, 57, doesn't matter. Your chart is your chart. It stays what it is. It is like an instruction manual, a graphic direction of what the main potentials are. And they are only potentials, of course, as we know. But they more or less frame the personality in its limited ways of expressing itself and potential qualities of the different functions that the planets stand for. And when we look at the birth chart and aspects in it, like we spoke about aspects like last time, this is a set fact. And yes, it could be modified over the course of life. You know how, for example, at certain ages, we are more using some of the functions. For example, our Venus is more accentuated. The function of Venus takes the central stage, and tend to be using that planet more than, say, another one, for example, Mercury. While at another period of life, things may change, and it's still our chart with everything in it arranged the way it is, but maybe we'll have our attention pointed to something else, and that would accentuate the function of Mercury, depending on how they are situated in the chart, whether they have more difficult aspects to themselves or otherwise are having a, let's say, an easier time. That can correspond also to situations when we feel like things are going smoothly, while others sense to be more difficult. If you have a very, like in this chart here, we can see there is Mars square Saturn, for example. So when the person is in any case in their life supposed to be using Mars and Saturn, and they are automatically, then maybe that won't be that straightforward. And it will seem like something has to be overcome or extra effort is required. And at another time, when this is simply not the action at the moment, things could be different. So, what we are using in astrology to realize which one of those functions that the planets symbolize is accentuated, is activated, is taking central stage in that particular moment, we can use the transits and the progressions. And now what you see here is an example, like a table of ephemeris. They look pretty much like that everywhere. You can have it as a book or you can look at it online. This is another story here. Nothing here is set. This table is showing us, in the duration of 1 month, the gradual and periodical movement of the planets in the sky, the way they are currently. Well, currently, or if we're checking back for a period in the past or maybe in the future, then we would see for that particular month. This is an astrological calendar, in other words, that every astrologer uses. And it's very important because here we can track day by day how the planets progress forward in the zodiac in their different speeds, because each one of them, as you now know, is having a very different rhythm and a very different cycle from the others. The first planets in the list are, of course, the very fast personal planets, starting with the moon, which changes its position very, very quickly. And every couple of days, we have the moon in a new sign of the zodiac. This more or less corresponds to a temporary emotional weather forecast, the position of the moon on the sky. Why is it changing its position so fast? Because in the lunar cycle, the phases of the moon, the relationship between the moon and the sun every month, which takes approximately 30 days, to, from beginning to end and new beginning, we have a total revolution of the moon around the zodiac in those almost 30 days. Because we have 12 signs of the zodiac, she travels through those 12 signs of the zodiac consecutively. And the result is that every couple of days and a half, we have the moon moved to another position. Well, this is basic knowledge for most astrologers, but I'm assuming some of you may be, more beginners in this, so I'm just mentioning it quickly here. So that's why in the first column, when we see on the 1st of April, the moon was in Aquarius, so was it on the 2nd of April, but then on the 3rd and 4th, it moved to Pisces, and so on and so forth. Well, the moment we go next in the table, we see gradually that it takes longer and longer to the planets to uh, move forward in the zodiac and in the ephemeris, in the calendar. The personal planets, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, are relatively fast. So within, say, a month, and that will be what I'm saying here will be very relevant to the progressions later when we start talking about progressions and what this technique is really about and how we calculate it. Bear in mind that the personal planets are fast. So within the course of a month, for example, they will change their positions. They would not stay in the same place where we found them in the first moment when we started observing them. Some of them more than others. But we can expect, for example, that Mercury in 1 month would have moved approximately as much as the Sun would have moved. They are Mercury and the Sun in the solar system are pretty close to one another. So the tempo, the speed of moving forward is quite similar. So in a month, we can see that Mercury will progress several steps forward at least. So will Venus and Mars. But when we get to Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, we're entering another territory. They become slower and slower in that order that they're given in the ephemeris. Jupiter will travel through one sign only of the zodiac for a year. So it spends roughly a year in the zodiac sign. Then Saturn I will touch on this actually in more detail later when we get to the transits, but it's just for illustration. Saturn is taking much longer. So, for example, it is, I think, approximately 2.5 years in a sign. So one sign for a year for Jupiter, 2.5 years for Saturn. And then Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, the generational planets, the very slow planets, they within days and months will probably not move at all, or will move very slightly, only a couple of degrees forward or backwards. Most of the planets, except the sun and the moon, because they're not technically planets, but they're the lights, the two bodies out there that are kind of having the greatest influence on the birth chart, and this pair of opposites, they are listed here. That's why sometimes it's a bit confusing. And having been into the habit of using these tables, these ephemeris for their work, astrologers are very used to saying that the moon and the sun are the planets as well. They are planets also classified like that. They're actually not, as a matter of fact. But let's see what is the difference there. What I'm really talking about here, that when we enter into the ephemeris and into this following of the motions of the planets that periodically come back to the same positions where they were as a starting point, we are now having a basis for predicting certain things, but those things that we can predict using this are not in concrete. They're not real events that can be strictly specified, but we can use the cyclic repetition of arrangement of things in the sky to assume what could be expected as a general topic, or when we are following these planets out there over the birth chart and how they travel through the different zones of the chart. So, for example, let's see this. Mercury, for example, let's suppose that we are observing the transits or the effects of the moving planets to this person whose chart we have here on the month of April, which is given in the table. I don't even know, 2008. This is just an example, obviously. And if out of curiosity, we wish to check where was Venus at that moment for them, we can see that on the 1st of April, Venus was on the 24th degree of Pisces. And we're looking at the chart here and checking where does Pisces fall in the chart. Here it is in the bottom here. 4th house and a little bit of the 5th house. The 24th degree, oh, this is a coincidence, I didn't check that in advance, but we can see here that this is the cusp actually. That 24th degree of Pisces is the cusp between the 4th house and the 5th house, the boundary between them. So on that day, this person was receiving a certain influence out of the state of the whole solar system, not just by Venus separately. And Venus wasn't really doing anything to the person directly as a planet, as some sort of magical power. But still, we can consider symbolically that there was a resonance of some sort between the position of Venus at that moment. The picture is much more complicated. We have to see what aspects Venus made with the rest of the transiting planets, with other things in the chart. But just if we want to check what area of life was receiving the transit of Venus for that person, we can see that that was the 4th and then beginning of the 5th house. And from there, we can assume that this function, their own function of Venus as well, is going to be focused on solving different problems or dealing with different issues related to the fourth and the fifth houses, or maybe this making of the transition between them. These two houses, the topics of them revolve around family, personal environment, um, private world, and then the people and the things related to that private behind the scenes world. And then moving on to the fifth house, we are including things like relationship with children or creativity and self-expression out there in the world. So yeah, we're not going to go through houses or anything like this, but this is just an example. Now, Dane wants to make this distinction of bear in mind the chart is fixed, while at the same time nothing is fixed. Everything moves constantly, and only the chart is fixed, which uh, presumes that this chart is something that is having an identity of itself, something constant about it. Yes, it will go through modifications, it will go through challenges. We'll see today that with the transits and the progressions, we'll see how the person will, over time, adapt and maybe have different reactions to the same stimuli. At one age, the same planet comes, like in another age, and travels to the same zone of the chart, but they have different responses to that because, for example, they have now grown older and more and wiser and more mature, whatever. But the chart still contains something like a seed, let's say, or an aspect to it, which is so personal and so constant that somehow it also has a feeling of self-preservation to it, that it needs to remain what it is at its core. So we need to keep ourselves in a way stable, in a way with integrity, based on how everything was set in the beginning in the chart and what instruction was given for our very specific personal potential. So now moving on, starting with the quotes, and I want to use those quotes just to then comment on things, and you can also tell me what you think. We're still in this matter of astrological prediction. So to what extent we can predict, what exactly we should predict, whether some of this is more confusing than helpful to people that come to see us. Uh, Maybe we have to debunk a lot of the general impression that people not that much into astrology have because of the media and because of the general publicity about it, that a lot more can actually be predicted or is worth predicting than in fact it is, and shift the focus not that much about figuring out what is going to happen to the person at what moment, but at why is this happening. If it is meant to happen and it's something that we can connect to, a reason there, the reason will probably be found in the birth chart to start with. The first quote is this: it would seem best to say that the birth chart, a space factor, refers to the abstract character of being, while the transits and progressions, time factors, refer to progressive realization of being. This is Rudhyar's way of talking. Sometimes it needs a bit of decoding because it's not as direct. But we should remember that he belongs to another generation and another style of self-expression, a bit more philosophical, a bit more esoteric sounding. But it's actually, I think, a pretty simple idea here, isn't it? That the birth chart, it's what I tried to explain in the beginning. The birth chart is a space factor. It is like a distribution of factors around you at the moment of birth, and that remains like a starting point to which we always go back to as a reference point of a sort. But the transits and the progressions, they can tell us how this potential will or is more likely to express itself and develop like a growing up process gradually from the beginning, from when we're babies. Of course, we haven't used up or explored the most of our potential, and we probably never will, but it is a gradual process of discovering the chart and embodying it little by little over life. Then here another comment about knowing about the future. The future is not something that happens of itself, outside of the individual. The individual's attitude towards it helps to create it. And this only makes it impossible to determine absolutely future events. It means that the astrologer assumes a great responsibility in conditioning his client's attitude toward the future. Now, the way I understand this is that nothing is predetermined, even if it may seem like it. That general transits, for example, and by transits I mean moving planets life at the moment we speak, real planets out there in the universe, in the solar system, objects that are a point of observation to astronomers, and then astrologers take them, take the data, and try to figure out what that means. But these things don't directly cause something, don't presuppose it 100%, but there is an element of participation of the person to whom, or maybe a group of people to whom this is supposed to happen, and a lot of modifications to the event exist within that. So we can point the events towards different outcomes depending on our attitude. And this is not discovering anything totally new here. It's just a confirmation of a statement that many other, I guess, spiritual practices or whatever else you guys may be learning and discovering is confirming as a fact that it's not some sort of we are being subject to external forces of positive and negative effect, and we can just be passive and wait for the situation to reveal itself without our participation. Our participation is key because the attitude changes the response, but also, uh, and maybe that is coming up on the next one, so I don't see it here. I would read you first the second one here, because that's like a continuation of what I was trying to say so far, that nothing can come out of a person which was not potentially within that person. Translated into the language of astrological technique, this means that whatever may be the impact of planetary configurations and influences after birth, this impact will follow the lines of functional response shown in the birth chart. So we can imagine all the things we have in our charts as our own personal prism or focal lens, for example, of perceiving reality. It is a well-known fact that everybody's reality is just limited to what our perceptions and what our human, senses, limited senses, are capable of perceiving. Maybe actual reality, if we can even say there is such a thing as actual reality, is something completely different. But one thing is for sure, that it is very individually perceived. There will be many commonalities and coincidences, of course, on which we can all agree. And we can all say that the flower behind me is obviously green and not something else, unless we're colorblind. But uh, there is a very big spectrum also of subjective thinking, and that is predetermined by what we already have set as um, maybe settings, like a computer setting in the chart. So just not forget though that each one of those settings doesn't do just one option, one thing. It is also creative in its own limited way. Venus in Sagittarius, for example, can do many sorts of things that would that would be under the category of Sagittarian Venusian action. But they are thousands of things, and they're not just a couple. So you see how it makes our job difficult to be specific and to be uh, pointing to either in time or in space about things that would be deterministic. There is nothing deterministic in astrology. Everything is potentially subject to whoever is working with it. And I think the beauty of it is that this gives the opportunity for us to be so creative while we are looking at the chart, and then the influences, so-called influences, transits and progressions on the chart, and seeing what is really awakened in that person in this moment. Every astrologer's interpretation will be different. But if we have this always uh, given as an advice from Dane, holistic view, big perspective, looking at the whole chart first and not just at individual bits and pieces here and there, maybe we will be more able to perceive a pattern that goes beyond just small uh, perceptions, reactions, or little events, day-to-day things that, yes, we can be very impressive by guessing those things and showing them to people that speak to us that are not astrologers and say, how come did you manage to realize that this is really what was going on in my life? Uh, Maybe that's not very helpful. Yes, we could predict a few things, and because things are cyclic and this astrological knowledge is a reflection of the cyclic motions, of course there will be some periodicity there that can be traced and can be noted down. But how we're using it is more important. So the other quote here is this: a birth chart is such an abstract symbol dealing only with a few basic functions, that it is impossible for the astrologer actually to deduce from it all that a client should like to know about his potentialities. Here is where the use of progressions and transits comes in, for by studying them, the astrologer may be able to learn which of these many potentialities will be accentuated through the process of actual living, which ones will focus the attention of the native or be brought to his attention by the pressure of his personal and social relationships. He may learn also approximately when these focusings will take place and under what general type of circumstances. This knowledge, if properly used, can contribute to the attainment of a fuller, richer, more total personality. I guess the idea here is to try to escape as much as we can, as curious as we may be, and as much as we may want to use astrology for getting a bit of shortcuts for certain things, or thinking that if we know in advance what is going to unfold, we can be more prepared. You know, this saying, uh, everything, be pre-warned so that you're prepared. I think some astrologers are using a saying like that to justify prediction. Uh, well, how exactly am I going to be prepared if I know it? I'm not totally sure about this. Maybe sometimes in another good way, even to an extent that if the event that I'm expecting is rather negative or unpleasant, I may, it's pretty certain that I will actually contribute to it being unpleasant by the mere expectation of it. And I would presuppose that, I would limit my reaction, maybe would totally panic or not be able to be with my clear mind at the moment when things unfold, will definitely not understand what is the reason for these things happening, and will simply turn the whole game into fighting with something external that I don't own, that I'm a victim of. And you see how this can start a not very positive cycle there. Well, the other option is to do what Roger is advising here, to use the knowledge for self-development, for being really empowered. Yes, you can be empowered, but then the astrologer that you are speaking to needs to give you a bit of perspective. This bad Saturn that is now troubling you and is squaring your Venus, for example, and causing presumably all those issues in your relationship life, what's the history of it? What's your natal Venus? What's your natal Saturn doing? In what state did it find them when it hit them? When the button was pushed, what was that button? So what was already in you that got activated? And he says in many places that nothing can come out which is not already in you. So you are at the end of the day limiting the extent to which good or bad things can unfold. And I know this is not very good news when we want to um, spare ourselves maybe the responsibility of using all those things as tools rather than uh, something external to solve our problems, or to maybe the other way around, justify our victimhood mentality, as usually that's how things are looked at. You know, in most places, in most astrological discussions out there and books as well, unfortunately, still to this day, the predominant idea is that a transit hits and you are subject to it and you're pretty much powerless. So as long as we can even a little bit change that perspective, I think that would be very helpful. Then moving on, now here, starting to get more specific, we are going to have two separate steps, one for transits and one for progressions. If you wish, at this point, we can make a very quick break if you feel like it. It's been almost an hour since we started, maybe just 3-5 minutes maximum. And then we'll look at transits, then another break before progressions. Okay? I will see you in 2 minutes, 2-3 minutes, just so that we can a little bit stand up and move about. Okay. I'm just checking the mics very quickly and we can go. Okay, well, actually, any questions so far? Any comments?
Should I ask some question?
Go ahead.
Which ephemeris we use? Tropical ephemeris, but Raphael American. Which ephemeris we use?
Doesn't really matter. It's a choice of the astrologer. I just wanted to show a very general example of ephemeris. Yes, Raphaels are one of the most famous out there, but there are others too. I often check at the website astro.com. They have very good ones too. If I want to check online, I usually just type on Google the year I'm interested in, say ephemeris 1954, and it gives me all the tables for the years. So yeah, I think that's up to you once.
Okay.
Okay.
And generally, uh, generally, transit we apply on birth chart, but progressed we apply on noon chart. Is it right?
Not exactly, not exactly. I will explain all this as we go along because now I'm
Oh,
going to focus on them. So hopefully that will come, that will become more clear as they go along. But
okay,
we apply both the transits and the progressions on top of the
okay,
birth chart.
okay.
But there is also, you are partially right if I correctly sense where you're going with this lunar thing, that in the progressions, there is one part of the progressions, which is called the procrastination cycle. And I'm going to touch on this as well towards the end.
Okay, okay,
Okay,
okay, okay, madam. Thank you.
you're welcome. Okay, so now let's continue with step 10, the study of transits and natural cycles. Here specifically about transits. Let's begin with the first quote. The study of planetary transits is to compare the birth chart and the state of the heavens at any selected time. In my estimation, the transiting motions of the planets after birth do not represent directly an evolution of the functions, the individual character of which was indicated by the natal positions and aspects of these planets, but rather a challenge to the structure of the birth chart considered as an unchanging archetype of individual selfhood. I think in short, he is telling us that the transits constitute some sort of challenge to the birth chart. As I mentioned in the beginning, if we say that the birth chart is a key to our integrity, to our wholeness as a person, to something that is with everything in it as a whole picture, is setting a tone that is our individual tone of life. It also sets a task for us, almost like this life was necessary. This exact arrangement of planets on the moment when we were born was necessary to appear at that moment in the world for someone to do a certain type of specific work. It's not always very easy to figure out what that work is. That's why we can use the birth chart as a way to decipher it. But the point here is that this is something of a journey. This is something of a task. And when we go through the effects of transits, then the moving planets on top of our chart, and when they are making aspects to our personal planets in the birth chart, then they are changing or challenging this integrity. And we need to respond. We need to adjust to, like, for example, a fish being transferred to a different kind of water, not the one that she is used to. And the environment changes, in other words. The transits are a reflection of the environment around us. The state of uh, everything that we are swimming as fish in, the conditions of our family, our society, the world, our workplace, family relations, everything that's outside of us, but we are constantly interacting with. And when transits change the situation, they usually reflect external changes in the environment, then for which we need to adapt in one way or another. He says all transits, except the passages of planets over the places they occupied in the birth chart. So let's stop this a little bit here. Except the passages of planets over the places they occupied in the birth chart. That means that, for example, Jupiter, the transiting Jupiter, goes around the zodiac in its own speed, and at a certain moment, it reaches the same position by zodiacal degree where our birth Jupiter was. And this is not going to be a situation of what he's describing here. This is the exception, or Saturn coming to the degree of our Saturn, or Mars coming to the degree of our Mars. These are the exceptional situations. Everything else, where Jupiter, Saturn, or Mars are sitting somewhere else and not where our birth ones are all the other transits. So all the transits tend to distort and disfigure the basic pattern of ourself and throw it out of balance. They are therefore challenges. If we meet them and remain true to our own archetypal truth, which can be read in the birth chart, then we have gained greatly in consciousness and in power. We have learned by overcoming change or opposition more about what we are as a changeless self. This is basically the same thing which I was trying to explain so far. Then, uh, in a very similar way, as I said, the moon is creating some sort of temporary emotional weather forecast during the month, traveling through those different signs of the zodiac that she moves through necessarily. And the moods change. You know how certain days have a certain energy about them, while other days, for everybody around, not just for somebody in particular, we can feel something in common. We can say, oh, today, the day here, in this particular place where we are together with another person, seems a bit low energy day, or otherwise, it seems to be very agitated, very actional. All sorts of things are going on out there in the industry, going on. We are witnessing conflicts, or we're witnessing stress. While in other days, it feels like time stops. This has to do with the position of the transiting moon day by day. This is the fastest factor in transits. It is because it is so fast, it's not such a significant one because it only counts for temporary uh, situations where it won't cause any particular events necessarily, but it gives an atmosphere, particular atmosphere. Then this transfers through the chart of the person, depending on where their birth moon is, will have a different effect, obviously. So today, for example, we have the moon in Taurus. The moon in Taurus affects me with my moon in Scorpio in a very different way that it will affect somebody else that has the moon in Virgo or Capricorn, for example, or any other sign. And it's not only moon to moon influence, it's the daily moon against the whole chart, we can say so. We all have those sensitive points in our charts where once the moon moves around them, through them, and hits them every month, we can really sense it in one way or another. But at the end of the day, the quotes here even are confirming yet the same idea of the transits being fundamentally this battlefield between the chart and the influences from outside. Every crisis is a challenge. Every definite progress aspect of transit is an opportunity for transformation, expansion, or purification. It is the door which opens upon the vast ocean of life and of the collective, universal unconscious. The main task of astrology is to help us to meet what comes to us through the threshold, and not that of speculating on some still remote openings of doors as yet unrecognized. Seems like the important thing that also quite often gets missed is that maybe it's more important to deal with the current transits before we think about the future transits. Like there is more opportunity in the current transits because we can literally respond to them now, make a plan of action, or think about it at least, rather than necessarily focusing on the future, which has still not come. And we don't actually have a big effect on our actions in the future. So again, trying to move the focus from the future to the present in a way. And it's amazing how much triple confirmation you can get about what's really important in somebody's chart, say if they are your client or friend or whatever. When you look not just at the chart, but also the transits and progressions in that particular moment when they come to you, or when they want a reading, or when they want to explore something about, maybe something specific, because there are those repeating messages. And the transits usually reflect a stress on something, a stress on Mercury, for example, or the moon in their chart. And this is not only the events that they're going through right now, but it's also reveals the state of their own moon, the state of their own Mars function. So how are they generally dealing with their feelings? And now under stress, what is the result? How are they generally self-asserting and expressing their actional self? And if that's working, if that has been working in the last month, in the last year, in the last 30 years, then this obviously will have an effect on how they're going to play with the transit right now. And here, Roger says, a transit is a focused manifestation of the unending pressure applied by nature upon the natal, archetypal structure of the selfhood. So transits are nature, as simply put as that. External influences. When a tree grows from a little plant up to a big tree, during that time frame, many things can happen to it from outside that would determine whether the end result will be success or failure, whether it's going to grow or die, what kind of fruit it's going to give. But this is not the only factor. The transits are only one side of the story, the external side of the story. And for the moment, I would just say the progressions are not. The progressions are not external. And you'll see later on what they are, actually. The whole thing we are going through today is pretty much trying to make the difference between transits and progressions. And of course, I'll also explain how to calculate progressions, because transits are already, this is the simpler part. You check it in the calendar. Where are things right now, or in a past or future moment? There is a calendar for that, called ephemeris. But also, of course, nowadays you can use a program, and we don't anymore do these things by hand. Now, like people, astrologers, only I think maybe 10, 20 years ago, or maybe less, were doing. Everything was checked manually and recorded. Well, nowadays we have such a luck to be saved enormous amount of time and effort by being able to just go on a website or using our software, immediately be given the positions of the transiting planets in that particular moment. Every time I open my solar fire, it automatically pops up the chart of the current moment. And this, in other words, the current transits. And then I have the opportunity to mix it with some other chart and see how those transits are affecting it. But this is also making us lazy, isn't it? And not asking the question, what does this mean? By looking at how it's calculated, maybe the ideas will come in our head of what it means. Well, everything being so automated now presumes that we can jump into interpretation, but knowing that transits are external forces and progressions is something else, we'll see what, could be key in how you would interpret things. Let's look at the 10 planets and their cycles, their cycle duration. This is a quick reminder, and maybe something new, to put things into perspective now. With transits, we're dealing with moving planets, and each one of those 10 planets is going around the sun. 9 planets, excuse me, the sun is the so-called 10th. Each one is going around the sun in its own period of time. Now, starting with Mercury, the closest one to the sun, the closer a planet is to the sun, the less it takes it to make one full circle. One full circle around the sun is also one full circle around the wheel of the chart, or the zodiac wheel. So if Mercury starts from a certain point, doesn't matter which point, maybe we can say 5th degree of Sagittarius. Then it will come back to the 5th degree of Sagittarius, having made one full circle and traveled everywhere else in 88 days. Now, then, sorry, here I'm not quite sure this is right. But yes, I think it is. Then when we go forward to Venus, then Mars, then Jupiter, then Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto in this order, the periods become bigger and bigger and bigger. You see how Mercury is, and then when we go to Pluto, the last one, the other side of the spectrum, which is the outermost planet so far having been discovered, we're talking about 200 and almost 50 years, taking Pluto to make one full circle. So what conclusion can we make? By transit, some of the planets are having a bigger effect on the circumstances than others. Some are having a more short-term event, very, very quick event oriented, not big scale effects, while others are accounting for major changes that are not even personal, but are changes in society, in politics, in cultural trends, in history in general. So Pluto is such a planet, for example, one that accounts for large-scale changes in the world. And it travels very slowly. It only covers a very small portion of the personal birth chart, usually up to 1/3 of it during one lifetime, while Mercury, Mars, Venus, not to mention the Moon, which is even faster, revolve around and repeat their positions many, many times during the course of a lifetime. And we have planets in the middle too, like Jupiter, Saturn. Saturn, the Saturnian cycle is a fundamental growing up human development during different crucial ages and stages, which is used as a clock to measure the gradual development of a person from early childhood, split into 7-year periods. But Saturn revolves around the zodiac in approximately 30 years. And it repeats that course, usually, if we're lucky enough to live up to 90, which is in some cases possible, it can repeat theoretically 3 times its cycle during the course of one lifetime. So on the one hand, we have actually 2 different things going on, if you think about it. On the one hand, we have the planets as they travel and are currently in some sign of the zodiac. They travel through sections of our chart, and they may hit planets. They may, kind of transition to particular places in the chart, like houses in the chart. But at the same time, we are following their own cycles. So we are following my Saturn from the moment of birth, where my Saturn was. I register that, and then I follow its journey forward up to the time when it comes back to the same place where it was in my particular chart, and the different steps that it hits during the process. So at ages 7, 14, 21, 30, and so on, it has important turning points in its cycle around itself. But then we have the Saturn for everybody, which is the Saturn in the sky that means something different because it's then applied to the overall atmosphere, the overall situation that everybody is subject to equally in the same way. So we all have our own special personal relationship to the planets and to their movement. This can be seen in the birth chart. Later, when we start looking at the examples, maybe that will become more clear. And then on the other hand, we have the current and ongoing change of the overall system, the overall arrangement of everything to each other, that is, having certain more tense periods that are more ripe for action out there in the world of a particular kind, a crisis maybe. And like in the 2020, we have this accumulation of very slow planets in Capricorn, the sign of big government, organization of society on large level, institutions, traditions, and so on and so forth. All the keywords for Capricorn. So we had in this particular historical moment that we astrologers were looking to a few years back with great interest in thinking what is going to unfold in 2020. Something very big it will be, obviously, because it is quite intense to have that many of the planets that are planets responsible for large-scale changes in the world cyclically, like Pluto, Saturn, Jupiter, and so on. They were all accumulated there. And Mars also at some point joined them to, as a bomb, as an activator too, last year. This was obvious that something will unfold, but nobody was able to predict exactly what it would be. It was close enough to know that it would be related to the Capricornian topics, that if anything is going to change, transform, that's going to do with these things that I just said, government, institutions, the way we are kind of organizing our social life, and so on. And did it not transpire exactly that way? It wasn't a war, for example, in the usual sense of how we are thinking of, a fighting conflict. It wasn't another sort of crisis, another type of crisis, but it was exactly this sort of thing. So to that extent, more or less, we can make predictions, but not specifically. We could never have thought, maybe guessed, that it may be a pandemic, because that's one of the few things in a big social transformative events. But that would have been a guess at the end of the day, and nothing astrologically would have confirmed it 100%. Now, just to complete this section here, just to sum up, personal planets, fast planets, the ones that are close to the sun, they change their positions quickly, so they change the weather, so-called weather, not as significantly. They don't account for major transformations, but they are short-term triggers. While the slower planets from Jupiter onwards, Jupiter, Saturn, and then Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto in their own category, they're the big transformers, are really turning things around in the personal life, majorly accounting for moments when the person needs to uh, reorient very drastically in a new direction, or solve a big problem, or understand something that they weren't really paying attention to deeply. And usually this comes hand in hand with painful changes and events that just push us in that direction, as we know that our nature is such that we would voluntarily probably not do that. And the transits are giving the necessary push and a necessary reminder, almost like a wake-up call of what comes next and what necessary next step is needed to be made. And then it's again up to us whether we will make it or not make it. And something will happen in any case, but uh, there is this very powerful free will, and it's not just a will, like a directional will. I want to do this, and I'm going to do it this way. But it's important if we understand what's the topic of the transit, and then we can grab the energy. When Saturn is transiting your 10th house, you can become very focused, disciplined, thinking clearly, and being very willing to put up hard work in your career area, 10th house, and you're proactive about it in one way or another. So you are automatically using up the energy of the transit, and you are directing it. But if you remain passive, probably problems in the work area will come up, which you would have to solve. So in both cases, there will be mobilization of the same qualities, of the same action. But in one case, you are doing it yourself, so you're using the energy, and maybe that way you're preventing a negative event. Because Saturn doesn't need two different things to act on. One is enough. So as long as the energy is used, you can kind of tick the box in a way. But if we're not proactive with it, then definitely we would meet the energy anyway. But as an external event, that may not be very pleasant. Okay, now very quickly, let's look at several groups of planets and how they are in transits. These last three, and I'll start from backwards in the solar system, from the slow ones, because these three planets are the transits of which we are being watchful and anxious about, and really closely observing. And when you do a chart reading, for example, and you put up the transits and you see that one of those three players is doing something important, hitting a personal planet, especially the sun or the moon of the person, or traveling through one of the four angles of the chart, then inevitably something will come out of this. And it will be important to explain to the person how to deal with it in the best possible way, how to creatively use it instead of becoming a victim of it. And this is because they are slow. Only Uranus will make eventually, possibly, one full circle during a lifetime. It takes 84 years for Uranus. And nowadays, this is the planet we're using as a framework for its cycle, is a framework of one human life and the stages of development. In the past, it was Saturn, the 2 times 30, 60-year cycle of Saturn, because lifespan was such. It was quite unusual only about a century ago for people to live over 60. While nowadays, things have shifted more towards Uranus and the 84 cycle. And this is a fundamental cycle. When we look at the chart, it is quite important to see what stage, what step Uranus has reached in accordance to itself. So if the person is 21 years old, Uranus will be making its first square, 45-degree angle, to the natal position. This is a generic cycle. Generic means for everybody. Everybody that is 21 years old will have Uranus square Uranus in the chart. Everybody that is 42 years old will have Uranus opposite Uranus in the birth chart. And this is crucial transit. Once in a lifetime transit, which is dividing life into halves. The first half of life, the second half of life. The middle of Uranus cycle. This corresponds to the midlife crisis and to all the changes. Actually, this is not the only cycle. There are many that come to some important, interesting turning point around age 42. And this is one way to approach transits. This has to be noted that if the person now wanting a reading is 42, this is the reason why they're wanting a reading, because they need to know how to deal with this crisis that they're feeling like is inescapable at the moment. Maybe they can define it. Maybe they don't know where this is coming from. Maybe they don't even realize that this is a crisis and know nothing about astrology. But if we are astrologers and we see this going on, we need to take it into account while reading the chart. Okay, just mentioning that as a difference to Uranus, Neptune and Pluto never make one full circle. They're just too slow. With Neptune, something interesting goes on that we may go through the middle of it. So Neptune may make half a circle in one lifetime. Uranus, one full circle. Neptune, maybe half. So Neptune can divide the whole situation into living years and what you leave behind, or what is your heritage in a way, or what remains of you after you are gone, something like that. That's the second part of the travel of Neptune. And eventually, If we reach about 80 years old, then half of Neptune. Pluto transits approximately one third of the chart. There are variations here because, as you probably know, Pluto is not very constant force. It's moves erratically a little bit on a very ecliptic orbit. And even though it always takes about 248 years to go around the circle, in the different periods of these 248 years, it doesn't move with the same speed. There are certain periods of time where it travels a very big, uh, kind of territory, while in others it is lower. So it's quite unusual. So in certain generations, this is a very generational planet, we can have a situation where now actually that we are all living in these times, Pluto has been pretty quick. And there will be situations where in one lifetime, a person has experienced Pluto going to one third of their chart or one third of the circle. And I hope you now sense how important it will be if within that one third of the circle that Pluto will move in your chart, you have something important going on. What if your moon is there, or your sun is there, or another personal planet, or maybe they are opposite that area or square that area? Then Pluto is going to activate them. And if the sun is there, the person will experience sometime during their life Pluto, transiting Pluto, over their natal sun. But another person may never experience anything like that in their life because Pluto will never touch their sun. Their sun may be in another section of the chart, the other two-thirds somewhere there, which Pluto will never transit over. Well, we can argue Pluto will maybe square that place or it will maybe oppose that place. But this particular major important transit, Pluto conjunct Sun, can happen to only a few people. And it is a very transformative event. Usually, when people have that event, it lasts several years. It's not just a transit over the course of several days or weeks, but because of the slowness of the planet, we have to extend the period. And we need to see the effect will be about 3 years, they say. Oh, this is subjective, but from when it's exact. So probably starting a year and a half before the aspect is exact, and continuing a little bit a year and a half after, going through different stages of kind of preparing to meet Pluto, then meeting it, something really happens, and then getting used to the changes in the next year and a half. So it's a transition period. Pluto over the sun or over a personal planet marks a very important transition period. And it's usually painful because of the nature of that planet by transit is cleaning and uh, breaking apart everything that is not serving a proper purpose, everything in our life. And if maybe we don't agree with it, and we think that we can keep with this thing, or want to keep with this thing, but Pluto never allows it. So again, there is a possibility to voluntarily put aside things that are like not positive practices, or maybe a relationship that doesn't work and needs to be ended. Many different things it could be, but usually Pluto is ruthless. I mean, that's why these three planets are usually feared and not that much liked, because people often don't realize the goodness of it. That Pluto kills, breaks apart, kind of brings death symbolically to something, but it's always for the good. It's always for a positive change, but normally that's not very visible until much later. So here, Rudhyar says, whenever Pluto crosses by transit an angle of the natal chart, a strong demand is usually made upon the individual as to the nature of his essential life purpose. Life purpose because the angles. Where Pluto is, there is the key to man's greatest contribution to society and to the universe. Now, this is something else. This is about the greatest contribution. You check where your natal Pluto is in the chart, what sign and what house, and that can give an indication of how you can contribute something to your generation. Yeah, because we all are born under a certain Pluto generation. For example, between 1983 and 1995, Pluto was in Scorpio, in its own sign. And for a very short time, it never stays in one sign for such a short time as it did when it was in Scorpio. So I happen to be part of this generation, and we are a small generation. The next time there is going to be such a generation will be after 250 years, after that time. And what happens is that Pluto in its own sign is quickest. That's why it spent so little, only over a decade in a sign. But then when it was in Taurus at the end of the 19th century, it spent 30 years in Taurus. So we had a situation when somebody, their father and their grandfather, all three of them had the same Pluto in the chart, the same sign. And we can see how there was probably a more of a consistency among the generations, we can claim, or people living together, generations mixing more and kind of being interdependent more, we can claim. Nowadays, very quickly, the Pluto generations set a different trend. And usually, in this particular way, Pluto by transit in mundane astrology, in world astrology, political astrology, say, which is not personal, is to do with what's the main thing in the generation that needs to be addressed as a major crisis. What is the deepest collective fear or the deepest collective self-preservation instinct? And this taboo topic that this generation will bring up in the surface and will offer for resolution to the unlucky other ones around it eventually. And let's finish here by reading the other quote. The cyclic motions of the trans-Saturnian planets, in other words, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, symbol the pressure of universal nature upon our limited ego. Those of the other planets, from Saturn to the Sun, the pressure of our particular type of organic, earth-conditioned human nature. The Uranus-Neptune-Pluto transits challenge us to become more than men. The other transits to become bigger and better men. The distinction is a very significant one. So here, maybe this is sounding a bit unclear. It's a repetition of an idea that Dane repeats many times, that we need to treat these three planets differently. I explained last time more about this, so I won't repeat myself, but up to Saturn, the transits regulate how we develop, grow up as a person, as an ego, as a limited personality within our environment. The other three are allowing for something extraordinary to happen, to go beyond our limits, to understand something maybe more spiritual, maybe a novel idea, maybe adjust to something, a bit of a more global view of life rather than just our constricted, limited environment. But then we're not necessarily participating in the things that Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto invite us to participate. It is still very new to us what these three planets signify, what they do by transit, how we should integrate them. We are learning, and it's going to probably take a while until people realize how to connect with these three planets that were most recently discovered. In ancient astrology and in traditional astrology, they don't exist. They're not there. They're not factors. They're not even discussed because nobody knew about them. Uranus discovered in 18th century. Neptune 19th, Pluto 20th. We'll see, maybe this century they'll discover something else. I look forward to seeing that. Maybe not, but for the moment, these three are some sort of alien energies that we don't quite yet understand. But obviously we can see that they account for very transformative changes when they hit us by transit. And long-term changes. Well, here we move on to the next ones. They are the pair, Jupiter and Saturn. So Jupiter and Saturn are between the last three and the personal ones. They're special as a group themselves. The so-called social planets. The cycle of Jupiter, 12 years, and the cycle of Saturn, 30 years. And when they combine together, we have this every 20 years they come together in a conjunction. Saturn conjuncts Jupiter. They are in the same place. And then the next 20 years, again, it's a regular kind of journey one with the other. Because in 20 years, they would reach the same position. So here we have every 20 years, Jupiter and Saturn come in conjunction. And this 20-year cycle has been considered in the past as basic whenever the destinies of nations and kings were concerned. It is still significant today in terms of the tidal movement of man's social consciousness and social fortunes. The places in which the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions fall in the natal chart at 20-year intervals establish foci of social destiny which are highly significant, especially in the lives of individuals who seek and assume public responsibility. So Jupiter and Saturn are all about how we participate in the social environment. They account for the political turning points, for the way society is being managed and all the rules and regulations within it, all its institutions and so on. The very, very basic distinction between them is that Jupiter is more about what we want to participate in that already exists out there. What school of thought? What are our interests? What kind of education we want to have? What religion we may want to practice? These are social institutions of which our Jupiterian function in us is making us take part in, almost like collective cooperation with other people in things that we are also interested in, like they are. It's more voluntary. While with Saturn, we are meeting the restrictions of society. Those things that put a stop and give us the limit to how much we can expand and whether we should stay within the constraints, let's say, of our culture, of our family. We've been given a particular name, and this name is a very Saturnian thing. You're called this and nothing else. This defines you, this limits you as well in one way. But Saturn is also making things work on a social level because it's the machine that has to be regulated. It has to be observed in a way that we can't leave things to chaos. Saturn accounts for the regulatory functions in society, the police force, the government, for example, and we can give many, many other examples. But because of those themes, when Jupiter and Saturn move by transit, that's what we expect to see as ongoing changes and events. And we recently had, like I mentioned last time, a conjunction by Jupiter and Saturn this year. So this once in a 20-year event for a degree of Aquarius. And it is still unfolding. We're still in the beginning of that new cycle that they started together. See how this coincides with the things we're going through in the world right now. And it's so logical to be the case. But with Jupiter and Saturn, it will not be very clear what these changes were all about and what's the meaning of them, what's the result of them, until 10 years pass, until we get to the middle of their cycle. Because at that moment, it will be something like a full moon between them. They will be opposite each other. And this is the moment of clarity. So at the moment, it's so natural for things to be very vague, unpredictable, unclear, and confusing. But the more years pass, the more the actions out there in the world, the actual political changes and social changes that we'll witness will give us a better physical idea of what this was all about. And then 10 years from now, there will be a shifting point. People would have to realize what's the conclusions and how they need to change the situation. Or maybe, I don't know, apply certain policies that would distance us from the experiences of those 10 years. Or maybe if it was a success, to reinforce that in one way or another. But the second part of the cycle of Jupiter and Saturn is very different from the first part. So, interesting times, something to watch out for. And then here, what you is talking about, look at your chart. Where does the conjunction fall? So, I'm quite excited about this particular last one that started in January. Jupiter and Saturn, both on the 0 degree of Aquarius, which happens to be my MC in my chart, exactly this degree. And you know how the MC and the whole 10th house is connected to issues of career development and social participation. It's a very social zone to start with. It's a very Saturnian zone. And having that conjunction falling exactly on my MC simply tells me that even if I'm not quite understanding yet concretely what to do with this, I need to pay attention to that. And I need to somehow have my focus on this area of life and see how my actions should mix with what goes on out there in the world, because this is the moment that these two things need to meet. Yeah, so like the person's personal career development is somehow intertwined with the social events. And this is going to pass. So already, you know, they're not together anymore. They're not, the conjunction has passed and Jupiter has moved forward. And in another year, 2 years, it will be a different story. So I would have to use the moment if I'm wise. And so would everybody that has it going on somewhere. And then we have the last ones, Mars, Venus, Mercury, the small planets, the ones close to the sun. By transit, they do certain things, but very temporarily, because they erratically kind of uh, change their position. Well, not erratically, but quickly, I wanted to say, quickly. And this is for your information. Mars, 687 days, Venus, 225 days, Mercury, 88 days. But this gets distorted a little bit because they often go retrograde. And I'm afraid we may not have the time to go into retrogrades. I promise one time we can organize a discussion just about retrograde planets. I think that would be interesting. But just to mention here that there are periods when these three planets, others also that I already went through, but these three appear to go backwards instead of forward. This is an optical illusion. It's not really the case, but that's how we register it. So say Mars is in 25 Sagittarius, goes to 27 Sagittarius, then becomes retrograde. Goes back all the way back to 10 Sagittarius, for example, and then returns again. So this is 3 times a year for Mercury. 3 times a year we have this period of retrogradation. For Venus and Mars, their cycle is about 2 years, each one, approximately. So they don't go retrograde that often. It is very significant when you have retrograde Venus or Mars in your birth chart, because that's not a common event. This happens only once every 2 years for a very short period of time. And it is more rare for Mars, a little bit less rare for Venus. I'm deliberately not being very specific here. But when the transiting Mars and Venus are going on their course and they travel to a zone in your life, they are accounting for those short periods of, like, I'm having a week, for example, which Venus is activating certain things. And then I pay attention, I go on holiday, or I'm more in a relaxed mode, let's say, rather than not. Of course, it depends which house we're talking about. But they are not that significant by transit. To quote here, the house or houses through which the planet, Mars or Venus, moves back and forth are given a particular transit emphasis. The challenge brought by nature to the individual focuses itself there. It is primarily a personal challenge and an opportunity for the individual to reorient his desire nature and his fate, Mars, and his sense of creative expression and value of attraction and repulsion, Venus, especially when the planet crosses 3 times its natal position. Uh, well, yeah, it's because they are temporary and quick, the changes that they bring are very personal, only about your own situation. They're not that global like the other ones were. And it's interesting when we have returns of those planets. It's very significant. Like when, as it says here, Mars comes back to the place where it was in your chart. And it will be about every 2 years. Same with Venus. Mercury once a year, because Mercury is pretty much hand in hand with the sun. And when you follow the sun makes one full circle in a year. It's pretty much the same with Mercury. Not exactly, but they are very close. In the zodiac, Mercury and the sun are never more than 28 degrees apart, which is a very small section. And when one moves, the other one moves along, if that makes sense. Now, a final word on transits is to do with this. Now, we covered all the planets apart from the lights, the sun and the moon. It's just worth mentioning that it is getting more and more popular for people to create what is known by solar return charts and lunar return charts. So these are the charts for the moment when the sun once a year returns to the same place where it was when you were born, or the moon once a month returns to the same place where it was in your birth chart. And certain conclusions can be made out of that. Obviously, the solar return is very important. We have had a discussion on solar returns. If you want, you can watch it if you haven't. And this chart of the solar return, when you impose it on the natal chart, it gives you so much information. It can reveal the whole nature of the main topics of that upcoming year. And the solar return chart is calculated on the birthday, because that's when the sun comes back to the same place where it was on birth. This is what a birthday means, a solar return. A lunar return, I think Rudhyar mentions that he doesn't recognize the lunar return as very significant, but some astrologers, they truly swear by it, and they say this is something that I use for prognostics, for predictions, for many things. And this is every month. Every month we have one moment when the moon is back to our natal moon. I find it a very sensitive moment. Something is being triggered. Yes, I feel it, every time because I have my calendar following the moon, and I can know every day where it is and when it has reached Scorpio. And I think ultimately it depends on what is your emotional state, your moon, your feelings, your circumstances day to day, how well you are, I mean, even health-wise. And when the moon comes back, it finds you in that particular state. And if you're not very good, it reminds you that you're not very good. So you become depressed, sad, confused, something like this, or the other way around. So I'm not sure to what extent it's necessary to make a whole chart for the lunar return, but you can experiment with that. Here the quote is, the time when the sun each year crosses the natal angles is often a challenge to the psychological functions these angles symbolize, thus precipitating certain types of events. The birthday period every year and the day when every month the moon returns to her natal position can usually be considered as times when the innate solar and lunar characteristics are given a new emphasis or revivified. Pretty much the same thing. Okay, and now, are there any questions, comments before we move on to progressions? And we need to check how we are with time. Good. Anything here that you wish to discuss?
Yes.
Or that wasn't very clear of this running through very quickly a lot of information that you need to go deeper into if you haven't really studied the cycles or something like this. Okay, in this case,
Nicely explained.
yes, Kieran?
Nicely explained.
Oh, thank you very much. I
Uh,
hope
uh,
so.
I agree. I think that was an excellent presentation. So I have no questions.
Thank you, Anastasia. Appreciate it too. Do you guys want another quick break before I move on to progressions, or shall I just continue? If you prefer.
A break.
Break, okay. 2-3 minutes, and we'll see each other again. So I think people needed a few moments to come back. Okay, so let's continue. Now, this is for me the most interesting part of the theory. And somehow I have a thing for progressions, and maybe because they account more for processes inside us than outside. Though transits also are ultimately about internal decisions, adjustments, and responses to the world. But here we have something different, and I hope I will give you something new today about this, because I can see, and I'm often getting, maybe angry is a very, very hard word, but I don't like it how much transits and progressions are misunderstood and not understood at all. Just equated with transits. We put one and the other. We've heard that this is a technique for prediction and we just use it automatically. But let's see what this is really about. And Rudhyar opened my eyes about this. I don't know anybody else having discussed them in this way particularly. And at the same time, it makes so much sense to me. Now, starting with a quote, what happens to us is what needs to happen to us. As we go on living and experiencing, we relate ourselves with men, with collectivities, and with the universe, which is dynamic and impersonal. We encounter historical tides, waves, and undertows. They move according to vast social and cosmic rhythms. Like radios being tuned in on this wavelength or the other, we experience these historical waves according to our own ability to respond to them, our selectivity. The progressed aspects made by our planets indicate changes in tuning and in our modes of response, but we can get through our receiving apparatuses only what is there. So the other name for progressions is secondary progressions because there are other types of progressions, like tertiary, for example, which I'm not gonna touch on, or they are called the solar progression. So this is giving us a hint that the sun is going to be quite important when we do progressions. And as it starts, I will just quickly jump forward to say, okay, here, I would like to explain first how it works with progressions because I see that it's quite unclear with many people how they calculate it and what they mean and so on. So first of all, what's the principle of this technique, progressions? As a difference to transits that were about real physical planets out there in the sky that we were following, and that can leave us with the impression that their effects are more real, more direct, more actual. Here we're dealing with something symbolic, something imaginary in a way. When we speak about the progress sun, the progress moon, and the rest of the planets, they're not the actual ones out there in the sky in this moment. So saying my progress sun is in Sagittarius right now does not correspond to anything tangible or anything that could be scientifically pointed to. What this is all about is the tendency that people have had from a very long time ago to make correspondences between different natural cycles that are all very fundamental for our life. And examples of these cycles are the day cycle, when we have this constant change of light and darkness, of the hours of the day, the hours of the night. This that gives us this direct sense of cycle, the day cycle, the sun disappearing and then appearing again in the morning. And the other big fundamental cycle, the year cycle of seasons and the seasonal changes that we can also observe. And back in time when we were living more in connection with nature, they were even more important to know and to follow and adjust to, because that's what survival depended on. But even today, we can see that we can tangibly feel the difference when we are moving through the different seasons. And this is the basis of all Western modern astrology, the zodiacal sequence of changes. That the tropical zodiac, the one related to seasons, is an expression of. Now, progressions as a technique make correspondence between these two cycles. And we assume this has been accepted as a way of working, and it does work. It does give amazing results, and nobody can really explain theoretically, scientifically how and why, but probably it is a little bit more than, there is something there, a bit more than just that these are two fundamental cycles. So progressions say this: you equate one day after the birth of a person or something to 1 year or the first year of their life. So several days after you're born, for example, 10 days after you're born, the personal planets, the rapid ones, Mars, Venus, Mercury, the Moon, and the Sun, would have already moved forwards, or maybe backward if they were retrograde, but they would have changed their position from the birth position. 10 days after you were born, you already see a completely different picture in the sky. The slow planets probably are the same. They're in the same place. And not just 10 days after birth, but 2 months, 4 months, 5 months. And you still see very slight changes in the position of Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and so on. So in astrological progressions, it has been accepted to use as factors only the personal planets. So when we talk about progressed planets, they're only Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, these five. Because they change their position significantly after birth. And what we're following are those months after birth, because 1 day equals 1 year. On the 10th day of your birth, if you had the sun in a particular sign, say sun in Taurus, it is likely, it's not necessarily the case, but maybe it already moved to another sign, or at least further along Taurus, in a further degree of Taurus, 10 days after you were born. Certainly would have moved 10 degrees forwards, because the sun, by progression, moves 1 degree per year. The sun that we observe, our sun, the transiting sun, moves 1 degree per month. That's why we have, 1 degree per day. That's why we have the sun through one sign of the zodiac for 30 days, then another sign of the zodiac for 30 days. So here in progressions, we are following the movement of those 5 planets and how much of a difference they made. And it is presumed that there will be some connection between the new chart 10 days after you're born. There is a chart then, which in fact is a transiting chart. These are the transits 10 days after you were born. These transits become your progressions on your 10th year. I hope that makes sense and it's not too confusing. So 1 day equals 1 year. And by doing that, we construct or calculate a progressed chart for the moment. So if I'm now, as I am 33, I have the 33rd day after birth as my progressed chart. And I register there where now are the sun, the moon, and the rest of the personal planets. And maybe by this time, they have moved to somewhere, or if I put them over my personal birth chart, which never changes, as you know, they may hit something. So the progressed moon would have definitely moved considerably forward in those 33 years. In fact, it would have made one full circle around the chart, because the moon, day by day, moves quite quickly. In 28 days, it makes one full circle in the sky. So, therefore, in 28 years, the progressed moon would have traveled through everywhere in the chart and returned back to its original place. Now I'm 33. My progressed moon is a little bit forward from having been back home. So when I was 28, it came back home. From 28 to 33, it moved forward. So this is what all of them are doing, all the 5. But the moon is the only one that repeats its cycle, eventually several times during lifetime. It's the only one that would cover the whole chart by progression. Because if you think about it, maybe 2 months, 3 months after birth, 3 months after birth are 90 days, isn't it? 90 days after birth. That should correspond to 90 years of progressions. And in those 3 months, all of our lifetime progressions are being, calculated. And in this 3-month period, the sun, which moves 1 degree per day, what could it do? It could in the maximum way, it could travel to 3 signs of the zodiac. Say start from Taurus, then go to Gemini, then from Gemini go to Cancer, and maybe that's it during the lifetime. But the progress moon, because it moves so quickly, it makes one full circle for 28 days, then another full circle, and another full circle, maybe 3 times a lifetime. By progression, we can have a rotation of the moon. So in the progress chart, or in the unfolding progressions over time, we have 2 categories of planets. The sun and the moon on the one hand, and all the other 3 on the other hand. The sun and the moon are the most important ones in progressions. Follow. Often, if you don't have enough time or the study of the chart is not to be so comprehensive, maybe even the other 3 can be slightly ignored, or even only note them if they're doing something very important. But the sun and the moon, and later we'll see the cycle, the progress lunation cycle, what it's called, is a very important factor of changes during the lifetime. But these changes that progressions make are internal changes. They are inner updates. And the way d.rudhyar is explaining it is that while we have ourselves, or let's say the project is the chart, the birth chart, we have the external factors that challenge it, the transits. But then we have a managing agent inside us, something like a project manager that lives inside you. And over time is scheduling the operations that one after the other, that turn comes. So it's like an inner clock. You can imagine it this way. The progressions are like an inner clock. So the movement of the progress moon, the movement of the progress sun and planets, they mark stages of life when we inside of us readjust. We readjust our way of looking into the world. I start with a sun in Scorpio in my chart. But now at age 33, the progress sun is in Sagittarius. And I have something like a double sun going on. I have my natal one and I have my progressed one. And the progressed one is temporary, obviously. The natal one stays the same, always. So in this 30-year period of my life, because the sun travels for 30 days per sign, 30 years per sign in progressions. For 30 years, the progress sun is in one sign. And I have a mixture between my natal one and this one. So I am learning a bit of Sagittarian individuality along with my Scorpionic one. And it's not purely Scorpio. It had been for the first 30 years of my life. I have this curious case of being born with sun on the 0 degree of Scorpio, for the very first degree. And that means that by progression, my sun will need 30 years to get out of that sign. So yes, when I was 30, it went to Sagittarius. And then it will spend from there 30 years in Sagittarius. Then it will move to Capricorn. Maybe that's going to be it. Well, depends how long I live. Interestingly, Venus, Mars, and Mercury are a little bit like the sun because they are very slow like the sun, like this. They take many years to move. Almost the same as the sun. They have a bit of variations, but you can easily expect that it will take Mars 30 years to go to a sign, or Venus 30 years to go to a sign. Maybe a little bit more or less if we need to be specific, but we don't have the time now to go through these things. Mercury too, but the moon is different. The moon is like the big hand of the clock, yeah, in the progressions. And we follow that moon, and that's what makes a difference. It is very interesting coincidence between the movement of this progressed moon, its speed, and the cycle of transiting Saturn. I don't know if you have realized this. Many astrologers know it, others don't quite, but it's easy to guess it because, you know, it takes Saturn 30 years to go around the zodiac and around the sun. So Saturn returns at 30, pretty much 28, 29. And the progressed moon also returns in the same age because it also takes it 28 to 30 years to come back to where it was originally in the chart. These are two totally different things, the transits and the progressions. They're calculated in a completely different manner. They don't have anything to do with each other as a logic. But these two things, time-wise, in the time frame of a birth, you know, of a living person, they would coincide. So you're going to have, say, some sort of a visit, important message by your progressed moon at 28, simultaneously when transiting Saturn is causing your transformations related to the first Saturn return. And same at 60 and same at 90. So that's something to bear in mind. But here is where Dane is explaining something that I was very surprised to, like, found it very interesting. And again, I haven't seen it anywhere else. Another way to explain the logic behind progressions, why we use them, why we need them in the first place. What's the point of equating this date to a year? Even though, yes, there is obviously something there that works, but look at that. He says we have 9-month pregnancy before a baby is born. This is something like a gestation period. And a full cycle of the sun from the moment of conception to back to its original place is 1 year, 12 months. You know how basic this 12-step cycle in everything is. So where are the other 3 months? Or what about the other 3 months after birth? And you can see that those 90 days equating roughly to 90 years of life makes sense now. It's like we follow the progressions because they give us this extra 3 months we need to finish the year and go back to the moment of conception of the baby. I know this is very metaphysical and very philosophical, symbolical thing, but it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? And then Dane is saying, during the pregnancy, we are developing our physicality, our organism as a physical organism, and as genetics, is those things that we take from the mother, you know, the strength of the body, the strength of the organs and so on. But then in the 3 months after birth, something else is getting developed gradually. Now that the baby is outside, can breathe, can interact with the environment, the brain or the intelligence or maybe the intuitive function, this higher than biological, whatever it is developing. So you see how this corresponds to then a code that we have in our head. What happened? What was the state of the solar system 13 years after we were 13 days after we were born? We are somehow attuned to this perspective on our 13th year. We have reached this step in our gradual growing up and readjustment. So we use the progressions as a tool for managing our life and for making decisions and for being a conscious response to what is going on. It is kind of the thing that merits, you know, the meeting between the birth chart and the transits. This is what makes it work, the progressions. So here I've got a quote: what occurs in the sky during the day following birth gives us symbolic information concerning what can be expected to happen during the first year of actual living. As a confirmation of that. The usually stated formula for such progressions is 1 day in the ephemeris equals 1 year of actual living. So that's the formula. And I hope it's quite simple, isn't it? But maybe that explanation about the extra 3 months is explaining to a degree, I hope, um, why we need these 3 months, why we need to pay attention to them, and not just finish everything at the moment of birth and assume that everything that goes forward as life is the same, has the same meaning. And now, just two quick quotes. I already told you this, that it's the sun and the moon is the two most important progressions, while the other planets are more modifications to the picture. The position of the progress moon, month after month, in terms of natal house and zodiacal sign, indicates the most vital focus of a person's attention at the time. And the progress moon is in a sign every 2.5 years. Then the next one for 2.5 years. In that way, in 28, it goes around all the 12. Saturn is doing the same, transiting Saturn. 2.5 years per sign. Isn't that interesting? So you may have heard how some astrologers connect, and obviously the moon with the mother principle, the Saturn with the father principle as a pair of planets. And maybe here we have this, the progress moon is the inner regulator, the inner world, and how we manage ourselves, how we conduct ourselves, how we adjust in a very lunar way, really. Well, the Saturn is the transiting Saturn. So this is the connector to society, to outside forces, to outside events. And it kind of makes sense for these two to go step by step together. The other quote is, the progress sun is intelligence in action. The progress moon, effective energy, parceled out to sustain the application of this active and intuitive intelligence. So they work together. Neither of them represent directly events, but the potentiality of intelligent adjustment to events. So we can expect events to come more from transits or from influence from outside. Here, we make a difference with our progressions of how we respond to these events. And finally, before we begin with the charts, we had a discussion on the progress lunation cycle. For Dane Rudhyar, this is a big topic. He's discussing it in many places, especially in the lunation cycle book. And while we spoke about the lunation cycle as such last time and before, we've never spoken about the progress lunation in this series. And here is what this is all about. Simply, we follow both the sun and the moon by progression and their relationship to one another. And we make note of the important moments when they are together in the same degree, which is called progress new moon. And then as the moon separates during the 28-year period it goes around, it makes one full circle and makes all those different aspects during the time with the sun. Last time we went through this. I don't want to repeat it, but last time when we spoke about aspects in the lunation cycle, you saw a demonstration of how step by step the relationship between the sun and the moon changes over time. And these are the phases of the moon in reality. Here we've got them into the progressed chart. So how the progressed sun moving 1 degree, one little, this markers of the degrees of the zodiac in the chart, in the circle, it only moves 1 degree per year, while the moon moves 1 degree per month. This is easy shortcut to remember, because when you look at the chart, you can see, oh, your progress moon is now at 10 degree Capricorn. So that means that in 20 months, it will be out of Capricorn. Does it make sense? So 20 more degrees to reach the end of Capricorn. And it moves 1 degree per month. So if I find the moon on the 10th degree, I know that it needs another 20 steps, 20 months to go out of the sign. And it's easy to calculate and just have a glance over the chart. With the sun, it's even easier because it only moves 1 degree per year. So 1 degree per year means that every time the sun, the progress sun, crosses an angle, like you see Simone has at the moment, the progress sun right on the MC. I don't have that chart, so I'm just mentioning it. And this is a very important event. So this progress lunation takes about 30 years to complete itself, and then it starts again. They meet again in some sign and some degree, and again, go through the different phases. So uh, we have to look for aspects made by the progressed sun to other planets in the birth chart and in the progress chart, and also we need to be wary about when the moon crosses the angles. Yeah, every few years it crosses one of the angles of the chart, and that's also something that can bring us, conclusions at what wavelength the person is at the moment and what turning point has come. Let's begin with examples to make all of this, put it into practice somehow. I will just take a look at the time. Oh, that's great. We have almost 45 minutes left, which is great, more than I expected. So we can, without too much hurry, I can run you through uh, an illustration of all this. So I have hidden all the birth details, but I have indicated the years when certain things have happened. And here I've just indicated that you were born in 1946, just so that it makes sense later with the transitions and progressions. This is the birth chart of Simona, and I think it's very important to start from a birth chart and look at it only that before we go to transits and progressions. And I will tell you several interesting things that I find crucial in this chart, like points to remember, because later we'll see how they're being hit by transits and progressions. What is a very big factor in this chart, I think, is the fact that the nodes of the moon, the north node and the south node, are almost exactly coinciding with the meridian, the MC and the IC. And by doing that, they are simultaneously squaring the ascendant and the descendant. So the nodes in this chart are activators to start with by birth of the whole cross of the chart. We can say that maybe this is a more fate-oriented personal life, where there will be hits from external situations, a more sensitive chart, let's say, because every time something by progression or transit goes through one of the angles of the chart, any angle, it automatically activates the nodal story and the nodal axis. And also maybe we can analyze it in another way, that the nodes, the so-called karma and dharma balance, will be something that she needs to work on very hard, that she will be reminded about again and again, will be pushed in all sorts of different situations in order to pay attention to sort of a mission that would not escape, would not want to escape. And it's not just the angles here that the nodes are on, but also what Rudhyar calls the axis of power, the MC and the IC. This balance between personal world and social world, how we prepare behind closed doors and how then we contribute something to the world outside with what we have done. So the nodes are very, very accentuated in that chart. We can see Sun in the 7th with a mixture of aspects, easy, not that easy. Okay, we just know that the Sun is in the 7th in Aries. The Moon is in the 8th house. You know how critical the 8th house could be in many ways. So just remember that, the Moon in the 8th house. And it is also quite visible that the major squares, the major tension points in this chart, are between the pair Saturn Mars here and this bit Jupiter with Chiron. So here we have very exact squares going on. But also, all the configurations are somehow interconnected because the nodes are speaking to them, to Chiron, Jupiter here by sextile. And then also we have the moon in a quincunx to this side and Mars Saturn when it comes to the other node. So we are going to expect that in this chart, when one of those several points, the nodes, this pair here or this pair here is hit by something, all the others will be hit. All the others will be activated. The two feminine planets, Venus and the Moon, are both in the 8th house. It's just a note. And we have these three planets here in the 1st and 2nd house, on the 2nd house, retrograde. So you see how this is going to make a difference in progressions later. We will continue seeing that chart. You know, we will start imposing things on it. But for the moment, I wanted you to see it just like this. Let's go forward now. And here I want to show you the 2 times when Simona had in her lifetime so far a progressed new moon and the progressed full moon. So this is the last thing that we discussed, the progressed lunation cycle. I'm sure that this is not totally clear yet for some of you because it's quite unusual. But I hope this is going to now make it very easy. In 1973, so she was born in 46, but let's actually go back to the chart. I forgot to tell you one important thing about the birth chart. This is the birth sun and the birth moon. And from what we see here, sun in Aries, moon in Taurus, that shows us that she was born on a new moon. Or in other words, just after the new moon. Just a few days before she was born, there was a new moon because the moon was with the sun. We can see that because we see that the moon has now separated just ever so slightly from the sun. And they are almost 34 degrees apart. Up to 45 degrees apart, it's called the new moon phase. So when she was born under a new moon phase. That means that the sun and the moon were close together. The conjunction had just happened. So now when we look at this, we know that the progressed sun from this point, 14 Aries, will only move 1 degree per year. The progress moon will move 1 degree per month. And eventually, as the moon is moving, traveling like this, counterclockwise, it will eventually come back to the sun one day. Well, this one day for Simona was in 1973, when the progress moon, having made one full circle from where she was initially, have reached the same place again where the sun is. And this is called the progress new moon. So here we see that both the sun and the moon are in Taurus in the same degree. And she was quite of age by that time. Why? Going back to the birth chart. Because, oh, I'm sorry, that's not what I wanted to show you. This is it. So the moon after birth being so close to the sun means that it will take it a certain number of years to come back to it. And in Simona's case, it will be quite a journey because the moon has to move from here all the way back here. Well, in that time, the sun would have went forward a little bit, not much, but would have went forward too. It wouldn't stay here in Aries and wait. But we can see that ultimately, in 1973, the sun was already in Taurus and the moon was back to it. Because the moon took, well, over 25 years. So what is it? 46 to 73 roughly to reach that point. And then we have this situation here. Now they meet in Taurus. The next time they meet, after 28 years, will be in the next sign, in Gemini, and then in the next sign, and so on. Because once the progress moon makes one full circle, the sun moves 1 30-degree span ahead. Is that clear so far? Any questions? Because that's the hardest bit. That's the most theoretical bit. Do you all get that principle of how things are?
I find it quite clear and very, very detailed.
Okay.
Yeah, you are doing that excellent.
You're a
Excellent.
natural teacher. I mean, this is a great, great detailed presentation.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I hope it's going to be like this until the end. But now,
I have a question.
yes,
So, with the progressed new moon, would that be to say that at that time she's experiencing something of a beginning or a start
mhm.
that is echoing what the natal moon is?
Well, she would definitely experience a new start big time, but that's not going to be that related to the natal moon. It's related to the cycle that is starting now. This cycle now in the 11th degree of Taurus. This is going to be the tone, the first tone of a 30-year cycle for her, 28 to 30-year cycle, where these both of them, the sun and the moon, will be under the influence of this Taurus energy. But the moon will go forward and will distribute it around the whole chart. And it will come back to the sun, and then they'll start a new thing like that in Gemini, the next cycle. But when we go back to her natal chart, I think what you're asking about is more relevant to the new moon before birth. That's why Dane is so much, stressing this importance of the new moon before birth, to check where it was, what degree of the zodiac, when it happened, and so on. Because this is actually for Simona, for example, the new moon that happened a few days before she was born was in Aries. So the moon was here somewhere with the sun in Aries. Yeah, that's why in 73 it's in Taurus, and then in the next one it will be in Gemini. So if we calculate that, which I haven't done for today, but I think I told her what it is, there is a way to calculate in astro.com as well. You can bring up the chart for your prenatal new moon, and that would be the day when uh, the cycle under which you were born began, and that this was a new moon at the time. And here I think it was probably a couple of days before she was born when this happened. And then the whole first 25 years of her life or so were under the influence of this Aries new moon before birth. Then when she was reaching 73, then a switch was possible to happen. Simona, now is the moment to ask you, is there anything particular that you remember as a switch in your life around 73? Concerning new
Absolutely,
direction.
absolutely spot on. Absolutely spot on. I can tell you exactly. I went to America, that's from London, and I met my vocation, meaning I met Ira Progoff, who I studied with, and who influenced my life in terms of work. Well, in fact, for the rest of my life, because I'm now, you're right, 30 years I was giving journal workshops, but I'm still working with that whole concept. So I haven't finished with it. So you're absolutely spot on.
So you're saying that 73 around was a year of relocation to a new country. It was a year of starting something new professionally and so on.
Yes.
So there were many significant changes that were the first steps of a long-term new direction. This is exactly what the new moon
And I
wanted.
found meaning. Yeah. Yeah. I found meaning in my life.
That's great. Well, what is
Yeah.
meant to be, what's meant to be happening here is that when we have the progress new moon, yes, there will be changes, physical changes that we make like you have, but we wouldn't really understand what this was all about and to what this is going to lead us, whether it will be a success or a failure, the way we understand it, until halfway through. like it was something like what I told you about Saturn and Jupiter, when after 10 years they reach the middle of their cycle. Here we're talking about approximately 15 years, because you know the whole cycle is about 30 years, so the middle will be about 15 years. So here we have the progress chart of Simona at 1987, which is approximately 15 years after 73, isn't it? And what we find here, the sun in Taurus, still in Taurus, even though you see here it was 10 degrees Taurus, here after 15 years, just in time, it's almost the 25th degree Taurus. So the sun literally has moved 15 degrees ahead. And the moon has moved a lot more. We know it's faster. And it's in 25 Scorpio. They're in an exact opposition. So these 2 points in the cycle are equally important. Yes, some people use the new moon, progress new moon, but not that many use the progress full moon. They both are extremely important, because in the full moon you can see, now you said you moved to London, you started new studies, maybe those studies started paying off, or maybe you saw what you need to change or how you need to adjust your education or your professional development around 87. Did you find any clarity about things in your life, like realizations, or being more urgent to make changes because you now know what this is going, where this is going around 87? Anything you can remember around 87?
Well, I have to look that up. I know my daughter was 4 years old. I would have to look that one up.
Okay.
I'm sure. Yeah, and I will do that. But thank you for showing me that date. I will look that up.
All right. And also
And I'll let
it's
you know.
worth, is for anyone interested, it is worth noting not just the new moon and the full moon, but the intermediary steps, the squares, and the other aspects that the progress moon makes to the progress sun during, and at what years they happen, because it is a gradual process of unfoldment of something, a team. Here the team was Taurus 11, and the team was in your 7th house, so maybe a lot of what this whole period was about, this whole 30-year period was about, was related to relationships, marriage, maybe problems within the marriage or whatever else. And basically, everything is concentrated on that area of life as a whole process. And then later we see a shift with the next cycle.
That could be something like that, but I cannot specify, but I shall
Okay,
look at it
fine.
up. Thank you.
This is generally what it's supposed to mean. And then another example, because I'm very lucky to have you as an example, Simona, because you have history in your life of 2 cycles. This is quite something that you can go back to. You can remember what in the different stages. I think you mentioned you're doing journaling, so maybe you can check the dates against the journals and see whether this cycle is really working the way it's supposed to. But the next time this whole thing happened for you was new moon in 2002 and full moon of that same cycle in 2017. You're laughing. What do you have to share?
Well, I mean, in 2002, I started my Jungian training. So I started, which was long, because I was also working at the same time. So that was, major. That was then. 2017, I'll have to think about it again.
Okay. Well,
I'm not
something
sure.
that eventually something that was planted in 2002 should bring you some results in 2017. This is like the general logic of it. But look at that Gemini stellium here in the progress chart. So they were obviously the next sign, Gemini now, where they met, the sun and the moon, and everything shifted to the 8th house. Yeah, because also we have the ascendant of the chart progressing over time. It's not just the planets. The whole ascendant very slowly, but we're starting with you having Virgo ascendant by birth. And then we see that in the previous cycle, it was in Libra by progression, while here at the full moon stage in 1987, it was already about to go to Scorpio, see here. And then obviously the next period is all on the Scorpio ascendant. So that's how the houses of the progress chart shift. Now, I want to finally do another sort of exercise, which is not the progress cycle, but we're going to look at two events in Simona's life, one in 1952, one in 1982, and see how, I mean, this is my process. You can do it in another way, but this is what I normally do when I try to mix natal transits and progressions and see where this takes me. This is the progress chart of the first event in 1952. She was about 6 years old at the time, yes? Between 6 and 7 years old. So we're talking about early childhood here, where something very traumatic and very significant happens. And first of all, I opened the actual progressed chart. This is the chart of the progressions. And you already know her birth chart a little bit. And you can see probably because of that, you can see that the sun hasn't moved a lot. It's still in Aries. Her birth sun was in Aries. Her one was at 15 Aries, so 14 something. Now it's at 20, 6 years later. The progress moon has moved ahead, yes. But we can see that nothing else has. Saturn, Pluto, Uranus, all of them are still pretty much in the same positions. So that's just a confirmation again that we're only following the personal planets in progression. Venus has moved a little bit, but okay. What I'm going to do is show you this chart superimposed on the birth chart, because that's what most astrologers do. But I think it's worth it noting the actual progress chart separately first, because then you can see the distribution of houses in the actual progress chart, like that the progressed moon is in the 11th house of the progress chart. Yeah, because then when we put it over the natal, we are not going to be able to see this. We're going to be seeing that. So here in the middle, you have, that's right, yes. In the middle, you have the birth chart. And then over it, the progress chart, and I've used selectively only the personal planet so that it's not very crowded and we're not interested in the others anyway. And I have just listed for you, this will be, because I know this takes time to sink in when you're doing it on your own, that's why I've listed it. And we'll just observe the things that are going on one by one. And hopefully we can get some comments from Simona about how this reflects real life in one way or another. You don't need to tell us what the event was. You can just speak about your experience or, you know, something else that you connect. But this is, say, we know that this is an important moment because something crucial happened, life-changing. The progressed sun is in an exact trine with the progress moon. So only progress to progress. This could have been seen even here, that the progress sun is at 20 Aries, progress moon at 20 Leo. Exactly. So exactly trine to each other. That is supposed to be important because they have reached a point in their cycle together, which is like an exact aspect. Then we have the progress moon square the natal moon. That must be significant. So now here for the first time we see some sort of effect of the progressed planet to the natal planet. And moon square. This is potentially traumatic, potentially sensitive. This is the square of action, the first square, not the second, where something physical, some sort of fight is going on with the world. And along the lines of moon topics, feminine topics, family topics. So things like that. Then we've got the progress moon square the nodes and the ascendant descendant. So actually, progress moon square the nodes. Hold on with me, something is not quite right here. That's not what I wanted to. Yes, well, yes, that's correct actually. Here, but it's not a square. It's in aspect to the nodes. Excuse me, this is some sort of typing mistake here. So it is in aspect to the nodes because here we're at 20 and here you can see 23, 23. So the nodal story is also activated in a way. We can see also that the progress Venus has now moved to the 8th house, exactly quincunx Neptune. This is the green line here. So the progress Venus, quincunx Neptune. The progress Mercury here is now direct. She has a retrograde Mercury at birth. This is another thing which I was meant to mention earlier, but here is a good point because here you can really see it. When you have one of the personal planets retrograde by birth, it is extremely important to note when they went in the other direction, or maybe they were not retrograde, but they went retrograde by progression. So here she's got Mercury retrograde at 28, 29 Pisces. But when she was 60 years old, we can see the progress Mercury is not retrograde. So what is going on here? It means that several years, and I've just checked that and I can tell you, this can be calculated. When she was 5 years old, Mercury, so 5 days after she was born, Mercury went direct. So by progression on the 5th year of life, it goes direct. And this is supposed to be an important shift in the function, so in the intelligence function this way. With her, this coincided with going to school for the first time, isn't it? And we have discussed that there have been many challenges in school that were a total contrast to your life before school, isn't it? And this is, I think, reflected, even though that happened at a very early age. For some people, this shift can happen later in life. So if Mercury went direct 15 days after she was born, it would have been later going into, the other direction. So that was an important moment. And here we can see it crossing the descendant, this Mercury, very sensitive. And let's look at the progress sun. The progress sun now at 21 Aries is opposite the midpoint between Chiron and Jupiter. So when you have all of these things listed, you start parceling out the full picture. So what touches what and how, what I can expect from that. Yes, but I wanted to demonstrate here that there were many influences, a lot of influences. And here we're only looking just at the progressions at that moment, not the transits. And the next step would be to see the transits separately. Here we've got them, the same moment. Here we have only the outer planets and Jupiter and Saturn and the nodes. We don't have Mars, Venus, Moon, and Sun because it's the opposite logic. In the transits, we're following the slow planets. In the progressions, we're following the fast planets. So what do we have here? Uranus exactly on Saturn. Well, that's a big deal. This is a big deal not only because it's exactly the same degree as her natal Saturn, but because her natal Saturn is involved in very hard aspects to start with. Yeah, so here Uranus comes as a shocker and activates this dynamic, then this dynamic here. But it activates it from one side, from the Mars-Saturn side. While on the other side of the dynamic of the square, we have actual Saturn, the transiting Saturn, together with Neptune, as if Saturn wasn't enough. together with Neptune over the Chiron-Jupiter pair. So what we have is transiting Uranus square, transiting Saturn-Neptune, but transiting Uranus square her Jupiter and Chiron, and conjunct her Saturn. This automatically means that it's around 7 years old. She's also going to her Saturn square Saturn for the first time. So Saturn square transiting Saturn. So this is a stage in life which is important for everyone, but with her, it coincides with the rest of the transits, with Neptune being there, with Uranus being over Mars, Saturn, and so on. And we can see that also it is quincunx, the north node. This is now the transiting north node. So Uranus gives this in entering the 5th house. Next one, transiting Jupiter on the natal moon in the 8th house. And that's pretty exact too, because Jupiter is pretty fast. I mean, this is the exact date that Simona gave me, but literally days after, Jupiter would be exactly on the natal moon. So the natal moon is, Jupiter is not always a positive, say, influence. Sometimes it's an exaggerator. So Jupiter makes greater what is already going on. And if what is already going on is not very positive, then Jupiter contributes to this being blown off even more. And I think this is what happened in this case. And a couple more notes on the transits. We're being selective here, just selecting those transits that are really obviously important. Otherwise, there are all sorts of transits going on. Then the third one is transiting nodes exactly square the natal moon. Now, this is also extremely significant. The transiting nodes in Aquarius and Leo at that moment, 18 degree, see, she has Taurus 18 as her moon. So Taurus squares them, both of them. Another pressure, another bit of pressure to the moon in the chart. Oh, excuse me. So then we see that one of those transiting nodes, the south node, happens to be with Pluto in the sky, right at the same moment. Now, I know that these are just facts that I'm listing here, but maybe you're already making some associations in your head, and now I'll let Simona discuss this when we look at everything together in a second. Finally, the transiting Pluto here, the big changer, lifetime changer, is trining her nodes and sextile. So sextile and trine exactly, look at that, 23, 23, 23. So this is a perfect example of the life-changing effect of Pluto. We already saw in the natal chart that the nodes will be crucial, that the nodes are activating everything. And here we've got Pluto directly corresponding with the nodes, exactly, 5 degree. And while doing that, it is sextile exactly natal Jupiter, which is also at 23. So that one here. And this basically means that Pluto is participating in this dynamic here that we discussed in the beginning, the Uranus, the Saturn, the Neptune, all of this, because it is speaking to them too. So I don't know what we can signal out here and say this is the most important transit or that's the most important progression. I think we should look at them all together and see how they mix, because the mix is what ultimately I think creates the more faithful event or not that faithful event. This is everything together. So what we just looked at, but natal chart in the middle, progressions second wheel, and transits outer wheel. So here I have only noted how the transits affect the progression, something that we didn't look at so far. So far we looked at progressions to natal and transits to natal. Here we've got also a few other bits that we can spot. that are to do with seeing the transits and the progressions together. And the first one is that the transiting nodes here, Leo and Aquarius, are on the progress moon. We wouldn't have been able to see that if we didn't have the triple wheel. You see, we may easily forget that the progress moon was there also in this place. And that's quite a significant influence. Then we have the transiting Saturn and Neptune, these two here, where the progress Mars. Progress Mars is here. And in the first glance, the progress Mars is not doing much because this is the original Mars and this is the progress Mars. Only a very slight difference between the position. But when this is happening now in the transits in the sky, where we have Saturn and Neptune in the sky squaring here, they're squaring more the progress Mars than the natal Mars. Also the natal, but actually the progress is more affected. So the way you are being found, the condition in which you were being found when you were in at 6 years old, you were not able to fight all those influences. There was a direct kind of attack on your current state, not that much on your birth state, which was difficult to start with because your natal Mars is with Saturn. And now we are receiving the influence from Saturn. And finally, the transiting Uranus is square the progress Sun. Anything that happens to the progress Sun is significant. So the transiting Uranus, this one, this culprit that was doing so much trouble here, you see, that we saw in the transit separately, is also hitting the progress Sun by square. So I hope this whole thing demonstrates with the whole sea of information that this was a lot going on for her in the same moment. Yeah, a lot from all sorts of different places. And sometimes maybe we can argue a significant transit on its own is not enough to provoke happening, but a combination with the progressions is also required. Yeah, something in both places needs to be triggered. But here, this was a very fateful event because you could do nothing about it. You were too young. But even if you weren't too young, this was one of those things that are just, I call it Pluto events. You know, that this was an event where something happens that is cardinal, not changeable, not resolvable, and we simply need to live with it. And we need to adapt to the new situation that it brings. And then from then on, it's a completely different course. So, Simona, if you wish to say something here, you're more than welcome, but it's entirely up to you what you want to say.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I'm quite moved by seeing it the way you have explained it. It's quite actually, I must look through this again because for the first time, this is something I've been working with, obviously, since that particular day when that happened, over and over and over in various ways, psychologically, spiritually, but and also astrologically in terms of, but not in such a detail. And this is fantastic to see it like this, because I will be able to study it even more. So that I want to say that, which is so positive. So thank you, Radilina, for that. That's amazing. Number two, I think I'm not going to keep everybody sitting on at the end of their chairs because I don't mind. I've worked with this so much and I still am, and I will for the rest of my life. This is an event that happened when, in 1952, which was that my mother took her own life. So that was, but I was actually not told to start with that she had been taking her life. So she just disappeared completely, like no one told me anything how she died. So I'm just going to say that because that might be seen in the progressions. But physically, she wasn't there anymore, and it coincided with the time when I started school. So I was wondering whether that was something to do. You know, I've got the moon in the 11th house, the progressed moon in the 11th house, and of course, you know, children are rather nasty with one another at that age. And I remember being bullied and you know, put down because I did not have a mother. So I think obviously that was the moon that was kind of reacting, obviously. What I also yeah, and you know, all that, I mean, makes sense to me. The Uranus, that is, it was like a kind of a bomb that fell onto my head. The way I actually discovered how she died was through dreams. So I had 3 significant dreams that in Jungian terms would be called big dreams, which have followed me all through my life and that I've worked and reworked on in various ways, through art, through ceramics and so forth, and through journaling. So I think you know, that whole thing, the Chiron, Jupiter and Neptune were very influential in from that particular time. And I can see that this Chiron Jupiter comes up all the way through my life. Actually, it's been hit every time. Yes. And I find that actually quite interesting. You know, I mean, also, you know, it's been a real trigger for pain. But I also think that somehow or another there is a saving point in it, which, you know, an ability to transform through those that aspect. I don't know what else to say. I'm happy to take any questions if anybody wants.
Enough. I just, before I forget, I want to mention something that I missed, which is extremely important. I just noticed it, and it wasn't in the list or anything. But look at that progressed sun. The progressed sun is this. Yeah. You see, I like this format of chart because it shows me the degrees of the cusps between the houses.
Yeah.
And we see that the cusp between the 7th and 8th house is actually that degree, the 20th degree, 21st degree. Yeah. So at that moment, the progress sun was switching houses. Exactly. Wow. And this is an extremely important moment. This is something to really watch out for. Not only when this progress sun switches signs, which is once every 30 years, but pretty much once every 30 years, it switches houses as well. So this is extremely significant, that the progress sun.
So coming back to that, of course, that started a whole new phase of, like you say, 30 years. Is that correct?
Yes,
you know,
30, yeah.
Of course, because I was left with my father on my own, and I did not have any brothers or sisters, or family at all. So I was left on my own after she died, and I had to become independent very quickly, emotionally, you know, in all ways, actually. So, you know, I mean, for me, that sun there in the 8th house, you know, that was hard, but, you know, I did it. I had to do it. You know, there was no choice, as far as, you know, because I was on my own. So that's very, very interesting. Thank you, Radilina.
Welcome. I actually had another, because I see we are now at 8:30 and you're probably already tired and it's the end of the session usually, but I had one more event, this exactly the same way. If you want, I don't mind staying another 10-15 minutes just to run you quickly through it, if you're curious, and then we can say goodbye. Or if you wish, we can leave it here at this example. Who wants to stay? Please give me a sign. If you're majority,
I'd be
I
happy to
say
stay.
I would also like to stay.
okay.
I will stay as well. I've
Perfect.
been here.
Okay.
I also had a question. I don't know if I was heard or not. Did you hear me about the?
No, we didn't hear you, Lauren. Say it now.
I was just saying, I asked if this was Capanus or Capanus, a house system
No.
we've been looking at.
No, as a matter of fact, I'm using Regiomontanus here as an example, but they are very similar. So it is like Campanus. Probably won't give you, if you use one or the other, it will give you very, very slight things as changes, almost none.
Okay, since it was going in the sun into the 8th house and so forth, I was curious about the house system.
Yeah, well, you see, this is the subjective thing about it. Because she came to me as an astrologer and because I use this system, that's what came out. If she had come to somebody else that uses another system, something else will come out. But everything makes me think that this is kind of a confirmation of that system in a way, isn't it? Yeah, this is one of the ways people, how is it called? They rectify charts and also rectify or decide which system to use is when they play with the progressions. Because the progressed sun is such a, it only moves, as I said, 1 degree per year. So you can easily figure out what was the year when it moved from one transition point to another. And that will give you the whole rest of it, isn't it? It will give you where it was to start with.
And the other thing is there's that lunarium in UK that I once did. Was that the both the sun and the moon that it offered?
It offers this progress lunation cycle stages. It's great. It's a website called Lunarium. If you don't have a software, because now I do this with Solar Fire, but if you don't have a software, you can go on this Lunarium and there is a calendar, you enter your birth date, and it gives you throughout your life the dates when you had progress new moon, first quarter, full moon, second, and again new moon. So during the course of your life, it's really handy. That's where I used to look it up before. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that.
Thanks. And sorry, could you also say what that house system is again, please? I didn't hear the first time.
It's called Regiomontanus. Regiomontanus.
Oh, Regimented. Oh, okay. Thank you.
It's one of the common ones. You can find it on astro.com. But I used to use Campanus, which Dane recommends. They're very similar. And yeah, I'm just experimenting, but lately I've been on this one, so that's why. I think Campanus wouldn't have given us any difference here. Okay.
I have a question.
Any other questions before we move on to the next example?
Yes, can you hear me?
Could you turn your sound a little bit up because it's very low at the moment?
I've been having this trouble. A lot of people have been saying this. I can't change my volume.
I can only barely hear you, and in the recording, probably it won't be old.
I can hear him okay, and I can repeat what he asks.
Okay, let's do that.
I'm just, from what I recall, I believe, like Campanus, the Regiomontanus system, they're both space-based charts, like they're based off of spatial divisions. And I guess I'm just curious, just simply put, in general, why you choose this house system, aside from, the relation to Rudhyar's preference for the Campanus house system.
So the very quick answer, and I'm sorry, it's probably not going to be what you expected, but the answer is in my second lecture. So my second lecture, number 2 of this series, is where we speak about this, and I made a distinction between some of the house systems and why the space-based, according to Dane Rudhyar, make more sense. It is to do with the houses. It is to do with the fact that the space-based house systems divide the houses equally based on the actual space around the newborn baby, rather than something else as a factor. And he believes that this is important, and I agree, because that's the most individual thing about us. You know, where on the surface of the earth we are observing the sky from. But this is a very short. I hope if you're interested, you can take a look there.
And I would add to that, what I got from that second lecture is that it has to do with humanistic astrology, how the person themselves experience and change. So it's from humanistically, it is made a lot of sense.
That's right. That's right. Well, for other systems, other house systems will be more relevant, I guess. But for this one, because we're assuming the most important thing is the person and their experience and their, how they are reflecting things, then we're using this, literally splitting the physical space around them into equal parts. And these two systems, Regiomontanus and Campanus, they are calculated that way. While Placidus is something in between. Placidus has the same logic for the four angles, but when it splits from first house to third house, it is time-based. Yeah.
Arcs. Yeah, the arcs are time-based. Yeah, I understand. I always like to ask any astrologer, why they like their house system of choice. I believe, of course, all of them have their own level of relevance, but I just wanted to know why you.
I'm really with you about asking the question. I think this is great, actually, because if there is advice that Dane Rudhyar is giving, is not that much use this system and not the other. He's asking, it's very important when you go to an astrologer to ask them to justify the tool they're using. You don't have to, but kind of to be interested in that. Why they're using what they're using, and what was the reasoning, the logic, the philosophy behind that. So yeah, that's a great question, of course.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to the second example. So I let you go sooner rather than later. If you want, we can skip it, but I think it will be interesting to see how there are some coincidences between 52 and 82. Now, here, interestingly, it's 30 years difference. You can see how you had a moment, Simone, in your life at 5, 6 years old where it was so charged. And then exactly 30 years on, there is another similar moment. So this is the progress chart quickly for 1982. Fast forward 30 years. We see the progress sun is now in Taurus, almost exactly 30 degrees further than where it was last time. It was at 20 Aries, now it's at 19 Taurus. Here we've got the progress moon in the same place. What's going on here? So remember, the progress moon was in the 11th house. It was making an exact trine last time around with the progress sun. Now again, it's making an exact trine to the progress sun. So that's logical if you think about it, because their cycle is 30 years. But we have the same situation, pretty much, sun and the moon, and still the same houses involved. And look at these. These three in the natal chart are in the first house. Now, by progression, they are in the 12th house. That's interesting, I think. Now, a lot of time has passed. So even, this is not that Neptune, for example, which is so slow and never really moves by progression a lot. Neptune hasn't moved that much. It's the ascendant that has moved. I hope you see that. The ascendant is now in Libra, at the end of Libra. So these planets now fall into the 12th house of the actual progress chart. And now let's go to progress to natal. Natal in the middle, progress outside. Here we have, now you see in the actual progress chart, the moon was in the 11th house, but when you put it over her chart, it's in the 12th house. And not just in the 12th house, but at the end of the 12th house. This is a very dark moment. This is something like balsamic moon phase, or the moment before something is born for new life. It hasn't crossed the ascendant yet. It's right at the end of the 12th house. So here, it's extremely sensitive, the moon. And yes, we already said it's in trine with the progress sun. But also, this progressed moon in the 12th house is square the natal nodes. Now, because it's so close to the ascendant, you remember how the nodes and the horizon, ascendant, descendant, everything is interconnected. Now the moon plays into that. It squares the nodes. Then we have the progressed Mars. It has moved over natal Pluto. Exactly. The progressed Venus has moved exactly over Uranus. This is quite funny, isn't it? They are both extremely slow, the progress Mars and the progress Venus. And in this particular year, they're both hitting on outer planets in her chart. And not any outer planets, but exactly Uranus and Pluto. Then we have that this Venus is also semi-square her natal Venus. And semi-square is an important aspect. It's not to be underestimated. It's 45 degree, because it's, Rudhyar says this is like when you are hitting a target, the 45-degree angle of launching forward the arrow is the most impactful angle. Yeah, so that's kind of it's a lot of movement when we have semi-squares. And then also at that moment, when progress Venus is semi-square natal Venus, we have Mercury over it, over the natal. So progress Mercury is part of that effect. And then we have progress Sun, this time transitioning again, not from the 7th to the 8th, but from the 8th to the 9th house. And I will review a little bit here that this tragic event, in this case, was followed by a happy event. So very shortly after this tragic event, we had a very similar but like opposite event. Literally 1 year or something like that, 7 months after. And by that time, the progress moon would be already in the light in the 1st house. And the progress sun is already like totally out of the 8th house and into the more cheerful, more expansive, more lively 9th house, in the beginning of the 9th house. And the progress sun and moon are exactly in the same angle, as I said, like in the previous event. Yeah. Okay, that was the progressions. Now the transits. Only 3 things here are marked. The transiting Pluto here is at the Jupiter-Chiron conjunction. And it's obviously activating her Saturn-Mars.
I don't see, excuse me for interrupting, but I don't see that the chart changed. Oh, now it did. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I don't know why mine didn't.
Oh, good.
Yeah, yes, it is. Thank you.
But the thing is that it, strangely enough, if I may say so, it's almost, I can see the repetition,
Yes.
but in time.
It's so interesting how the same transiting planets, they hit different parts of the chart, but they are in both cases extremely active. And same with the progressions, they repeat the same pattern. So definitely these two events are somehow interconnected, maybe in a way that is beyond you. Maybe it's a karmic thing or something, that these are both events that had to happen to you so that you go through a crisis, but maybe then after that re-emerge for stronger and better. And somehow, yeah, it was a necessary challenge in a way. But then we can go back to this Pluto. It is not just over these, but it's also sextile and trine the nodes. Again, exactly. Look, 24, Libra, 24, Gemini and Sagittarius. So here, this is the most exact aspect, by the way. Like Pluto with the nodes, with the natal ones. So again, we see them. And opposite Venus. You see? So natal Venus is opposite Pluto, and then all the rest of it, which we already said. Now, Neptune. Here, Neptune is the bigger factor, almost like last time it was also, because last time it was over here, remember? But this time Neptune is on the IC. And on the IC, we have South Node. So, and opposite North Node. And then the whole story about the nodes again. And this makes me think that, again, it's very, from the prospect of time, you know, going back in time, this simply should give some sort of reassurance that that was a necessary thing, that it was unavoidable, and that had a certain positive role for you, that as painful as it could have been, it's been positive at the end of the day, because something needed to be cleared here in this South Node thing. Yeah. And also, it is square Mercury, because Mercury is on one of the angles. It just happens to be part of it here. And Neptune and Pluto, they are in this constant sextile, you know, during the whole, almost the whole 20th century. But here it was exact. So Neptune is kind of dragging Pluto into the picture, and Pluto Neptune. So the two sets of aspects here and here, they mix. They're not happening independently in different parts of the chart. They're part of the whole scenario. That's at least how I see them. And finally, the transiting nodes are exactly square the natal sun. Transiting nodes, they change every year. So in this particular year, the transiting nodes were so positioned, Cancer and Capricorn. And look at the houses in your 4th house and 10th house. I know that this is, again, more of a family kind of event. So these are the family houses. So, and the family signs, Capricorn and Cancer, and they square exactly your sun in the 7th. So yeah, good illustration, I think it is, of motion. And finally, this is the everything together, like before. And what else I was able to spot here, which is not in the other two, was that this Neptune that we saw on the IC is also square the progress moon. You know, the progress moon is the biggest factor in the progressions. Neptune is square it. Then the transiting nodes, these same ones that we just mentioned, are in aspect to progress Venus. So progress Venus is here. Well, this is not really, see, because we have 13 here and 13 here. And the progress Venus was basically, what is this? So she's in, this is the quincunx, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But she plays into the relationship with the nodes, because the progress Venus is so slow again that it's always a big factor when it's affected by something. And transiting Pluto is opposite progress Mercury in the 8th house, where the natal Venus is at this moment. So natal Venus, progressed Mercury and transiting Pluto, they align, the three, in the 8th house. And finally, Chiron, the transiting Chiron is, I think this can be counted as a conjunction with the progress Sun, even though it had already passed, but within a period of time when Chiron was on your Sun, on your progress Sun. Hence, this is, I think, following that way of, you know, taking the time to list all these things and look at them this way, certain things pop out as patterns, as they point to the same thing, kind of thing. And I think the conclusion we can all make out of this exercise, hopefully, is that everything started here in the natal chart. Because if you didn't have those sensitive nodes on the MCIC, if the moon, oh, sorry, that's not it. Excuse me, that's it. If you didn't have those sensitive nodes here, the moon in the 8th house, Venus in the 8th house, and everything, the timing of everything was possible to be calculated from day one. Yeah, we could have seen if you had taken the time to, to do this laborious exercise, checking what the situation will be in your 35th year or something like this, we would have found these aspects there, and we would have known that you're in for something. But what exactly, we don't know. But we would know that it's going to be very likely to involve 8th house topics, for example.
May I ask, Simona, did you say to us what happened in 1982, what she just said? Was that when you went and met your teacher over in the United States?
No, but I'm going to ask Raderina, is this the moment when I can say what happened in 1982?
You can if you want, you don't have
Yeah.
to.
No, I'm just going to, then I'm going to tell you, Lauren, in 1973 was the time when I met my teacher.
Okay.
And I went to the States. But I find this really interesting to see this now, because the event of 1952 and 1982 are actually interlinked. And I'm going to say this, that in fact, all the transits and progressions that we did together, excuse me, wait a minute, that I responded to are actually to do with the journey of the feminine, crises of the feminine at different times of life up to the present moment. But to come back to 1952 and 1982, in 1982, actually 1981, I had a baby born in 1981, and she died in August 1982. Okay, so, and I'm going to say this, that first of all, what she did to me was that she actually gave me the opportunity to express finally the grief that I had not been able to express physically and emotionally at the time of my mother's death or after. Yeah. Because of course, when she died, her name was Natalie, you know, I was in tears, distraught, in despair. I was suicidal, everything, right? I wanted to follow her into death, literally. And in fact, I took her down to the morgue, and it felt as if I was following her into death. She was, for me, in fact, and this is not an exaggeration, she was not a real baby. She was actually a spiritual experience, really. I've written about her, and in fact, during that time, 1981, 82, I spent, because she spent all of that time mostly in hospital, and I was staying in hospital with her, I spent it writing in my journal. That was my way of keeping track of what was happening inside myself, dream-wise, emotionally, and with the doctors and so forth. So really, she was a transpersonal experience. In fact, I felt it was a very traumatic experience, but I feel so privileged that I had that experience. I've thought many times in my life, would I have not wanted to have that experience? And all I can say is I would not have wanted to miss that experience for anything in my life. She made me a therapist. You know, I think both my mother and her made me the therapist I am. Without them, I would not have been able to, you know, to be the therapist that I am. And I've always believed that, you know, you can't take people further in therapy than where you've been yourself. So I was grateful for those two experiences, however tragic they seemed. So that's what I've got to say.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I feel very like a new level of education from this experience today.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you.
Yeah,
Very
Simona.
grateful, Simona.
Oh, sorry.
Yes,
Simona,
go ahead.
really thank you. Really thank you for sharing that experience. And I'm really thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I hope that, you know, it's brought something for all of you in the sense of how, you know, transformation that, you know, you can only go, you can't go further than to the very bottom of the pit. And then when you are at the very bottom of the pit, there is no other way but going up.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah, I agree.
one of the ways that I survived all this. Thank you.
Also, for me, it's so important that when we're looking at astrology and then we're having clients, this is so to take the astrology and understand the potential of the events that happen in a person's life is when we're working with a live client, they're looking for help usually.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you both.
This level of understanding that you were able to give because of that is also important.
Sorry?
The level of understanding that you said you were able to give because of everything that happened is really important, and it's so often not realized what you said, that the therapist can only give as far as they have went.
Absolutely. And absolutely. And, you know, I have to say that that is from, I don't know where I got it from. I probably was born with this, I don't know. But, you know, I've always felt that all my life experiences have been a reason for them, and that they were to do with using them in a positive way for others. That's always been how I felt about it, and I feel even more now like that. So really, it's important. So that, you know, that is a way that you, if you have that, in fact, if you have that in mind, then you can possibly go through so many incredibly difficult things in life without feeling a victim. You know, you will feel a victim during a time, but then you just, you know, you move up again. And just to say, you know, because you might not be able to say this, but, you know, after the death of little Natalie, I got pregnant quite quickly. And I gave birth to another little girl who was completely different. She is really anchored in life. She was huge, while Natalie was a small for dates baby and spent most of her time in an incubator. My second daughter, she is a whirlwind of energy and incredibly creative, and is a total joy, even though sometimes she gets on my nerves. So, you know, I'm saying that because, you know, that's been just amazing. You know, it's been such a privilege to see a person grow, you know. And so when I look at babies and sort of mothers being really nasty to their children, I always think how privileged one has to be. One has to remember what a miracle birth is. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. You really moved us, I think, everybody. And I just realized when I was listening to you that today you have your lunar return. I don't know if you know that. So it's all been
No,
revolving
I
around the
didn't.
moon, isn't it? Yes,
It is.
yes.
Thank you, Radulina. You're amazing. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
It turned out much better than I planned because first of all, I didn't know that there was such a strong connection between the two events. I really considered them as just two major events, but I never,
Well,
you hadn't shared with me this bit
no,
about how one grief kind of helped, live the other one, which wasn't.
absolutely. It was just incredible, just incredible. And so I shall always be grateful for that little soul who incarnated. And then, I think when she was in her incubator, I think she must have gone through at least 10 lives. I always had the feeling that that was her last life and that her dad and I were really supposed to take care of her and keep her, help her to go to the next phase. So it was quite amazing. Strange to talk about what? Yeah, no, if I think you think about it, strange to talk about a little baby's death like that, but it is true. And she touched everybody's life, because I had a lot of support from all my therapist friends, and everybody was she was larger than life. And that's a transpersonal experience is larger than life. So it's interesting. I feel very privileged.
I was wondering, when Radulina, what did you say that today? I mean, her progressed Jupiter, wouldn't that be in 2018? Didn't you? What did you say about her Jupiter?
And maybe it wasn't very loud or something. Maybe you didn't quite hear me. It was the moon. What we call a lunar return. It's pretty simple, but today the moon is in Taurus. That's what it's all about. That she has the moon in Taurus by birth, and today is the day when the moon returns to the same place. And
Okay, thank you.
isn't it such a good example, that thing that you
Amazing.
brought back to lunar topics and not just like immediate ones, but out of all the days that we could have picked for this meeting and for this example, this was not deliberate. I just realized, oh, well, today you have some connection with the day. So that was meant to be somehow. This is how I interpret it.
I can't tell you how much I have learned through my session with you and today. Really, I can see, because the other two bits that we talked about also have to do with the feminine, and that's to come to up to date. And so the whole of my life has been to do with the lunar, the feminine and pain and tragedy, but then also growth.
Yes, and maybe one more final thing to say here is that what we saw out of those two example events, the only big coincidence, like the only literal coincidence, was this exactly the same aspect between the progress moon and the progress sun. So this brings in the progress lunation cycle and shows how two obviously connected events that you said now, this confirms the theory that they are connected. They happened exactly on the same phase of that cycle of the progress moon with the progress sun. So I use this cycle to when I'm feeling like I need to justify my astrology with a client that's a little skeptical, for example. That doesn't happen very often, but say if it needs to. When you check the dates of the last progressed new moon, full moon in their life, especially the new moon, because there will be only a couple like that, you know that something important really turned around in their life at that moment. And when you mention, oh, but what about 1975? What happened to you then? And they immediately like stare like this. And they, how do you know? You know, how do you know that something happened then? Actually, I don't know, but it's just the connection with the progressed relation. Yeah, that always somehow corresponds to something. So, yeah. And we are at the end, finally. Thank you very much. A couple of books for recommendation, like every time, where you can read more about what we already spoke about from Dane Rudhyar. This last one, the Astrology of Transformation, is a bit more philosophical, but it's just the end section of it. It's about transits and progressions. Some more interesting things there. On the other side, the person-centered astrology is easier language, so easier to get into. You know, if you missed something about how to calculate something or his actual thoughts, because I just kind of through my own perspective saying it. And the astrological timing is about the big cycles of history. It's so interesting if you're more into history and things like that. Like how the transits, especially of the larger cycled planets like Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, how they over time we can see correspondences to historical events and trends and things like that. So thank you everybody for this very long session today, but I think it was worth it to take a look at the examples, wasn't it?
Especially if you started an hour earlier. I tuned in.
Oh my! So some of you have been hanging up with me for even over 4 hours today.
You're
For half a day.
Half a day, yes.
Adelina, you're amazing.
Thank you everyone once again, and I will be waiting for you next week for the last part of this.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. This was
Astrocartography. We'll be talking about
incredible.
astrocartography. Not only. but
I'll
also
watch it via video. I know I won't be there.
Yeah,
And
there'll be a
happy
video.
birthday, Lauren.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Simona, for opening up and sharing with us.
With
Yes.
absolutely greatest pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
And I'm going to be binge watching these other videos of yours, Radalina, because wow, all I can just say is wow, you are something else. You are
Oh, thank
amazing.
you. You're flattering me, but I'm grateful. So, share if you like them, share them.
Grateful to have you, and we're grateful that we keep going together. It's a good group.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm grateful that I found you.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Anytime.
First time.
See you again.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you everybody one
Hello.
more time.
Thank you.
Thank
Hello.
you.